Out there in the Appalachian night, a campfire can feel like a tiny island in an endless black ocean of trees. The people in these stories went out to hike, hunt, or relax under the stars. Normal trips, normal campsites, nothing special. But somewhere between the trailhead and their tents, something in those mountains seemed to notice them. 11 Most Disturbing Appalachia Camping Horror Stories. Welcome back to Haunted Fears. If you're new here, join the Haunted Fears horror family by subscribing and turning on all notifications so you never face the dark alone again. Footsteps began to circle when no one was there. Voices whispered their names from the dark, and strange lights moved through the trees with purpose, not like fireflies or passing cars. By the time they realized something was wrong, their phones had no signal. The nearest help was hours away, and the forest around them had gone unnaturally still. If you're part of the Haunted Fears horror family, get comfortable, turn the lights down, put your headphones on, and listen closely, because these campers all thought they were safe until the woods finally answered back. You're not going to believe this, but the calmest night I've ever had in the woods turned into the one that still keeps me up sometimes. My name is Dylan, and what happened on that trip is the reason I don't whistle in the forest anymore. I went out into the Appalachians alone at the end of October, just before the real cold set in. I'd been stressed for months. Work, phone always buzzing, never really feeling like my brain shut off. A solo weekend looked like the perfect reset. No service, no crowds, just a tent, a fire, and a couple of quiet nights. I picked a national forest area with a mix of marked trails and unmarked spurs. Nothing too extreme, just far enough from the main road that I could feel properly away from people. The day I hiked in was perfect. Clear sky, that thin fall light that looks like it's coming in at an angle all day. The main trail had a few day hikers, but once I took a narrow side path that dropped into a small hollow, it felt like the woods swallowed everything else. The path was faint, just a suggestion of a track, really, but it led to a little shelf above a shallow creek with an old stone fire ring right where you'd want it. It looked like the kind of spot locals use when they're not in the mood for official campgrounds. I checked around out of habit. No fresh trash, no lingering smoke, no gear hidden in the brush, just a lot of dry leaves, mossy rocks, and the soft rush of water at the bottom of the hollow. The slope behind the tent spot rose into thicker trees, and the other side fell down toward the creek. It felt protected without feeling cramped. I remember thinking, this is perfect, and no one knows I'm here. I set up my tent on the flat patch near the stones, hung my food on a decent branch, and got a small fire going. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast, but the air was clean and still. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and watched the sky turn from pale blue to deep navy through the gaps in the branches. The first stars came out, and the creek's sound blended into a kind of soft background hiss that made everything feel farther away. At some point, without thinking, I started whistling. It's a short pattern I've been doing for years to call my dog back at home. 4 notes, up, down, up, and then a longer last note. It's built into me enough that I don't notice when I do it. I whistled it once as I poked the fire, then again while I shifted a log, not paying attention at all. The sound went out into the hollow and came back a little softer, like it got soaked up by the leaves. Nothing about that moment felt creepy. It was just a guy by a fire, humming and whistling the way people do when they're finally relaxed. I put a last piece of wood on, watched the flames catch, then let them settle into a steady bed of coals. I sat there until the cold started to sneak through my jacket, and my eyes got heavy. When I finally crawled into the tent, I was about as calm as I'd been all year. I don't know what time I woke up. It was the kind of waking that doesn't come from a dream, more like your brain gets gently shoved from behind. I stared at the dark fabric glowing faintly with moonlight and realized something about the night had changed. The creek was still there, but I couldn't hear anything else. No crickets, no wind, no distant branches shifting. It was like the world had hit pause. Then, From somewhere down in the hollow, I heard a whistle. 4 notes, up, down, up, and a longer last note. For a second, my mind tried to make it normal. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe some random bird had made a weird call. But then it came again, a tiny bit louder, echoing off the sides of the hollow, just enough that I could tell it was coming from near the creek. It was my pattern. Not just close, exact. Same rhythm, same length on the last note, same tiny hesitation between the second and third. It sounded like me, sitting at the fire again. The first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was confusion. No one had followed me in. I hadn't seen another tent. The trail that led down here wasn't obvious if you didn't know to look. The whistle came a third time, and this time I could tell it was slightly higher up the slope, no longer right by the water. I stayed absolutely still. One hand slid quietly toward the small flashlight near my head, but I didn't turn it on. The tent suddenly felt very thin. I could imagine every seam, every zipper. I pictured a shape just outside, listening, waiting. I wanted to call out something simple. Hello? Or, you okay out there? But the part of my brain that usually shuts up in favor of logic was very clear for once. Don't speak. I lay there, listening, heart pounding, while the forest held that unnerving, heavy silence around the sound of the creek. Then something small hit the ground just outside the tent. It landed with a soft, dull thud, the kind a smooth stone makes when it hits packed earth and dry leaves. Another one followed a couple of seconds later, closer to the front. Then another, near my feet. They weren't big. It wasn't like someone was hurling rocks, but each impact was placed with weird precision. None of them brushed the tent. They landed just beside it, like someone was tracing an outline. I counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then, after a pause, a fifth, almost at the back corner. The spacing was too deliberate to be random. If it had been an animal, it would have sounded messier, more scraping and crunching, less clean individual thuds. The whistle returned, softer now, almost like it was being done under someone's breath. It floated from somewhere to my right this time, not down by the creek anymore. The 4 notes blended with the slight rustle of leaves, then faded. I realized I'd started holding my breath between each sound, as if my breathing would give away exactly where in the tent I was. A part of me tried to latch onto the easiest explanation. Someone's playing a joke. Some local hunter saw my campfire smoke before dark, decided to sneak down and mess with the out-of-towner. It wasn't comforting, but it was at least human. That theory fell apart when I realized how quiet everything else was. No uneven footsteps, no huffing breath, nothing but that repeating pattern of stones and that stolen whistle. The stone sounds stopped. For a brief moment, the silence was so complete that the tiny sounds inside the tent, my heartbeat, the rustle of my sleeping bag when my chest moved, felt like they were too loud. Then I heard breathing from just outside the tent wall. It was close enough that I could feel a faint change in the air temperature. Slow inhale, steady exhale. It didn't sound strained or out of breath. It sounded calm, controlled, like whoever was standing there had all the time in the world and nothing to prove. The breathing shifted slightly as if whoever it was leaned in a bit, putting more of their weight on one foot. I could picture the shape without wanting to. Someone in boots, maybe a jacket, head bent toward the tent, listening for any move from me. Every instinct I had was telling me to do nothing. No light, no voice, no sudden movement. Just keep being a lump of silence and nylon. I don't know how long that went on. It might have been 20 seconds, might have been several minutes. Time felt stretched. My fingers cramped around the flashlight from how hard I was gripping it. At one point, my throat clenched like I was going to cough, and I remember swallowing it down so hard my eyes watered. Eventually, the breathing started to move away. I heard the faintest crunch of leaves this time, like someone placing their feet with care. The sound went around the tent, paused briefly on the side opposite where it had started, then drifted down toward the creek. The whistle came once more, distant again, carried up the hollow, then nothing but the creek and the deep, empty quiet after something leaves a room. I lay there for a long time, counting slow in my head, waiting for any sign that it had come back. My muscles ached from not moving. Every sound the tent made when the fabric shifted felt too loud. At some point, my body finally overrode my brain's panic. I fell into a shallow, restless sleep that didn't feel like real rest at all. When I opened my eyes again, the tent was pale with early morning light. Birds were calling, the creek sounded normal, and the world had that cold, damp feel you get just before the sun starts to hit the ground. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I unzipped the tent and saw the ground. There were footprints all around the tent, in the dirt and leaves I'd flattened a bit when I set up. Boot prints, not bare feet. The size looked medium, maybe around my own. The tread was clear enough in the softer patches to see the pattern. They went around. The tent in a loose ring and a couple of uneven arcs, sometimes closer to the fabric, sometimes farther away. There were no clear approach or departure tracks. That was the thing that froze me. Around the tent, disturbed leaves, compressed soil, overlapping prints like someone had paced slowly, stopping in certain spots. Beyond a certain rough circle, the ground looked undisturbed, except for my own obvious trail in and a couple of scuffs from when I'd walked back and forth collecting wood. Down toward the creek, almost nothing. A few displaced stones on the slope, but no obvious trail of steps leading in or out of the area where my camp was. Up close, the prints bothered me more. In several spots, the same footprint shape showed up twice, slightly offset, like the person had shifted in place instead of stepping away. The toes all pointed toward the tent. There wasn't a single print that angled outward, as if whoever it was had never turned their back on where I was lying. I walked carefully around, making sure not to step on any of them. I could see the small stones that had been thrown during the night, too. They were still where they'd landed, a few near the front of the tent, one by the back corner, another near where my head had been. I picked one up and turned it in my hand. It was cold and ordinary. The only thing unusual about it was that I knew exactly when it had landed. The sun hadn't fully cleared the ridge yet. Long shadows still lay across the hollow, and a thin mist hovered near the creek. I thought about staying, making coffee, trying to reset the day into something normal. But my body had already decided for me. I broke camp faster than I ever have in my life. I kept glancing up the slope, expecting to see someone standing there, half hidden by the trees, watching me with a casual curiosity. No one appeared. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every little sound on the trail, the crack of a twig, the flutter of a bird, made me tense. More than once I stopped and listened, convinced I'd heard the start of that 4-note pattern somewhere behind me. It never came, but the anticipation sat on my shoulders all the way back to the car. I've told this story only a few times. People usually ask the same questions. Are you sure it wasn't just some other camper? Couldn't it have been a hunter? Maybe you followed someone else's prints without noticing on the way in. I understand why they say it. They're trying to put it back into a box where it stays human and explainable. I tried that for a while, too. What I can't get past is the combination of details. The exact whistle. The stones landing in a careful pattern, never hitting the tent. The controlled breathing inches from my head. The ring of footprints with no path to or from the circle. The way the forest went, dead silent just before it started, as if something needed everything else to stop. I still go out into the woods. I still camp alone sometimes. The mountains have been part of my life too long for me to give them up because of one night. But there are lines I don't cross anymore. I don't whistle out there. I don't call into the dark just to hear my own voice echo back. And when the night gets too quiet, and the air feels like it's listening, I lie very still and remind myself that whatever is out there already knows my name, whether I say it or not. Great, clear brief. I'll keep this story's tone and structure different from Dylan's, and I'll stay under your strict limit as best as possible. But you'll still want to run a quick word count in a text editor to trim or pad to exactly 1,800 if needed. Since you didn't pick a specific narrator name, I'll choose one from your list for this story. Briar. You ever stare at the sky so long, you start forgetting where the ground is? That night on the ridge above Harlan, it felt like the stars were the only real thing left, until the lights showed up in the trees below us and made everything else feel wrong. My name is Briar, and I used to love night drives up into the hills around my hometown. When you grow up near the mountains, you get used to sneaking out with a couple of friends, finding some high place where town looks small and far away, and talking about all the big things you think you're going to do once you leave. The night this happened started exactly like one of those plans. We drove up to an old ridgetop site near the ruins of a fire tower. Just 3 of us, a cooler, and a couple of cheap sleeping bags. The drive up was half the fun. The road climbed in tight switchbacks, the kind that make your ears pop and your headlights feel like they're pointing at the stars instead of the asphalt. Down below, Harlan looked like someone had spilled a handful of orange and white glitter in the valley. Once we turned off onto the rougher gravel road, even that dropped away. It was just the crunch of tires, the occasional thunk of a rock under the car, and trees pressing close on both sides. We parked at a wide spot where the road sort of gave up pretending to be maintained. The air was colder than it had been in town, dry and sharp, the kind that stings your nose when you breathe in too fast. When I stepped out and looked up, it felt like the sky hit me physically. No streetlights, no parking lot lamps, just a huge black bowl full of stars, thicker than I'd seen them in years. We hiked the last stretch on foot, packs over our shoulders, the beam from my headlamp catching dead leaves and pale rocks along the narrow path. Every once in a while, the wind would come up from the valley side, strong enough to push at my jacket, then drop away as soon as we dipped a few feet back into the trees. There was that weird contrast you get on ridges out here. Up top, the air is moving, louder, almost clean. Just a little lower, down in the trees, it's like someone shut a door on the wind. The old fire tower itself was long gone by the time we were old enough to come out there. All that was left was a cracked concrete square in the ground, rebar and rusted bolts jutting up at odd angles. Somebody had spray-painted over parts of it years back. Names and symbols, half worn by rain and sun. The foundation sat right at the edge of a drop-off you couldn't see the bottom of in the dark. Just a wall of black where the trees fell away. We set the tent a little back from the edge on a patch of half-frozen grass and bare dirt. It wasn't a big tent, but we figured we were mostly out there for the sky anyway. We strung a light from the car battery for a minute, just to get things sorted, then killed it so we could let our eyes adjust. Below us, the woods on the slope were just a darker kind of darkness, a rough texture under the stars. We passed around a couple of drinks, talked too loud about nothing. Work stories, old high school stuff, the usual. Every now and then, one of us would just stop mid-sentence and look up. The stars were that distracting, that thick, like someone had lifted a ceiling off we didn't know was there. You could see the faint belt of the Milky Way, the kind of detail you forget exists when you live under constant sodium orange glow. It was sometime after midnight when the first light appeared. I wasn't the one who saw it first. I was sitting with my back against one of the broken concrete corners, shoulders starting to ache a little from the hard edge, when one of my friends went quiet in the middle of a story and leaned forward. I followed his eyes down toward the tree line below us. At first, I thought he was pointing out a car way down on a road we couldn't see. It was a pale, soft white glow, hovering low between the tree trunks, maybe 20 or 30 feet off the slope. It wasn't bright enough to hurt. It didn't have the hard edges of a flashlight or the color of a phone screen. It was just a round, steady orb, like a lantern without a handle. "There," my friend said quietly. "You see that?" I squinted. "Yeah, maybe someone's walking a dog or something down there." We all knew that made no sense. There was no trail directly below the drop-off, just steep ground and thick growth. The main road was way off to the left, and any headlights would have thrown beams, shadows, something. This wasn't like that. The lights seemed to be behind several tree trunks at once, glowing through them, but not lighting the ground the way you'd expect. As we watched, a second orb eased into view, a little farther downslope, moving from right to left. It matched the first in color and size, like they'd been cut from the same pale fabric. A third joined them a moment later, slightly higher up. The three of them moved together in a rough line, gliding, not bobbing like someone carrying lanterns, not swinging like a light on the end of an arm. "Okay, that's weird," I said, trying to keep my voice light. It was weird in a way that didn't trigger panic yet. More like curiosity edged with unease. The orbs weren't doing anything dramatic. They weren't zooming around or changing shape. They just drifted, slow and smooth, weaving between the trees without casting any real shadows. It was like watching three dim planets pass behind a forest that shouldn't be transparent. Then my phone buzzed once in my pocket and went dead. I pulled it out, thinking maybe someone was texting me, but the screen was frozen on the last thing I'd looked at earlier. A weather app with the temperature and some little cloud icons. The time at the top read 12:14 a.m. and wouldn't change. I tapped the screen, hit the side button. Nothing. Just that one frame, stuck, like a screenshot I hadn't taken. "You guys still got service?" I asked. They both pulled their phones out too. One of them had been on a music app earlier, but his screen was frozen on the playlist. The other one's lock screen showed the same time as mine, down to the minute. No bars. The battery icons were stuck in place too, no movement, no little lightning symbol to show charging. "Great," one of them muttered. "Guess this is what we get for coming up here." The lights below didn't care about our phones. They continued their slow path along the slope, now rising slightly, now dipping, always roughly the same distance from each other. Every once in a while, one would pause, while the other two moved a bit ahead, then catch up again. It looked less like random movement and more like a pattern none of us understood. "Let's record this," I said, "because that's what you say now. Nobody wants to be the person who sees something strange and has nothing to show later." We all lifted our phones and pointed them down at the trees. My camera app opened, but the preview screen was just a flat grayish blur. No tent, no trees, no friends, nothing. It was like the lens was covered in fog, except when I turned the phone toward my hand, I could see my fingers clearly in the top corner. Then nothing but mush, where the rest of the world should be. "Weird," I said. "You getting this?" "Mine's worse," one of my friends said. "It's like static, but not moving." The third guy said nothing, just lowered his phone slowly. His jaw muscles were tight in that way people get when they're pretending not to be scared yet. We lowered our phones together, and the scene snapped back into normal clarity for our eyes. Trees, slope, stars above, and those three pale orbs, now slightly higher, almost level with the height of our ridge. As they rose, a faint sensation started in my chest. Not a sound exactly, more like pressure. Imagine being too close to a big amp, with the bass turned up, feeling the vibration in your ribs, even if your ears don't register it as loud. It was subtle, like someone laying a hand gently but firmly on the middle of my sternum. "Do you feel that?" I asked. "Yeah," one of them said quietly, "like being inside a car with the engine running." The orbs were closer now, not right up against the edge, but near enough that I could see them clearly. Each was about the size of a basketball, maybe a little larger, but it was hard to tell with nothing right beside them to compare. Their light wasn't uniform. It pulsed slightly, a slow throbbing from the center out, like breathing. They moved in small, controlled lines, never bumping into each other, never hitting a tree trunk, even though they passed right where branches had to be. For the first time, real fear cut through my chest along with that humming pressure. Up until then, I could pretend we were watching some weird atmospheric thing, or lights from a hidden campsite, or even something human staged. but the way those orbs moved made it very clear that they weren't random. They were choosing where to go. "Maybe we should get in the tent," one of my friends said. "Just for a bit." It was an odd suggestion because a thin layer of nylon wasn't going to protect us from much of anything, but the idea of having something between us and those lights suddenly felt better than sitting totally exposed on the concrete. "Yeah," I said, just to warm up. We backed toward the tent, trying not to take our eyes off the ridge edge. The lights didn't react. They hovered, drifted, rose a bit more, then sank, as if pacing the invisible boundary of the slope. The pressure in my chest intensified for a few seconds, then eased, then came back in a slow wave. Inside the tent, the air felt immediately different. The wind noise from the ridge became more muffled, and the smell of cold earth and nylon fabric took over. We left the zipper partly open and switched on one small lantern, its glow turning the tent walls into pale, thin skin. All three of us sat there listening, watching the slice of darkness visible through the opening. The humming sensation came through the ground now, faintly. At least, that's how it seemed. It wasn't like a rumbling truck or anything so obvious. It was more like sitting on a bridge and realizing after a few minutes that you can feel every car that passes below in your bones before you hear it. "This is stupid," I said finally, my voice low. "We should just go back to the car. We can drive down, and if we see anything on the way, fine. But I don't want to stay up here all night with that, whatever it is." Nobody argued. The silence that followed wasn't indecision. It was everyone collecting enough courage to move. We unzipped the tent the rest of the way, and I stuck my head out, half expecting one of those lights to be right outside, hovering at eye level. There was nothing, just the dark outline of trees, the faint path, the stars overhead. I stepped all the way out, my boots crunching on the frost-stiff ground. The ridge wind hit me again, sharp and real. I walked carefully to the edge and looked down. The slope was visible in rough shapes, trunks, patches of pale rock, the suggestion of a game trail cutting diagonally across. No lights, no glow. The woods below were just woods again, black and indifferent. "How long have we been in there?" one of my friends asked behind me. I checked my watch. The dial hand said it was 3:20 a.m. "That can't be right," he said. "We went in the tent like, I don't know, 12-something. It felt like 15, maybe 20 minutes had passed. Half an hour at most. There hadn't been any long stretches of sleep or quiet. We'd been on edge the whole time, listening, talking a little, checking outside. The idea that over 2 hours had gone by while we sat there in that thin little shelter made my scalp prickle. We grabbed our phones again. The screens were still frozen on earlier images. The time at the top of each screen was the same as before, 12:14 a.m. The battery percentages hadn't changed. It was like the devices had been taken out of time and put back without any of the in-between. "Restart them," I said. We held down buttons, swiped where we could. One by one, the screens went black, then flashed logos, then came back to life. This time, the lock screen showed the current time, a little past 3:20 a.m. Notifications piled in, delayed text messages, random app alerts, all at once. It felt like the world we'd stepped out of earlier had finally remembered where we were. For a brief moment, I thought about packing up and hiking straight down in the dark. The urge to leave was that strong, but the rational part of my brain argued for staying. The way down was steep, narrow, with loose gravel in spots. One bad step, and someone could get hurt. The car was close, sure, but not close enough to justify stumbling blindly toward it with our nerves shot. "Let's just get through the night," I said. "Sun's not that far away. We can leave first light." So we stayed. We didn't sleep much, if at all. Every time I felt my eyes droop, a small sound would jerk me back awake. A shift in the wind, a creak from the tent poles, my friend turning over in his bag. No more humming in the chest, no more strange lights, just the cold hours grinding slowly forward. Morning came in layers. The darkness softened to gray. then to a faint blue. The stars faded, one by one, until only the brightest hung on near the horizon. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, my breath turned white in front of me. The ridge looked ordinary again. Scrubby grass, bare branches, frost clinging to the edges of the old concrete foundation. And the ground around our tent was covered in footprints. They were boot prints, like ours, pressing into the thin layer of frost and dirt. At first, I thought we had just made more of a mess than I realized the night before, walking around in circles. But as I followed them with my eyes, a pattern emerged. The prints formed a rough ring around the tent, always between 2 and 4 feet away from the fabric, never closer, never farther. Some overlapped slightly, like someone had stood in one place a bit longer, shifting their weight. All of them pointed toward the tent. "Tell me we did that," one of my friends said quietly. I walked slowly around the ring, careful not to step on the prints themselves. Beyond the circle, the ground was comparatively untouched. Our path to the edge, to the fire tower foundation, to the spot where we'd parked. Those tracks were obvious, messy, angled all over the place. This ring was different. It had a rhythm to it. What made my stomach drop wasn't just the shape. It was the way the prints started and ended. There was no clear trail leading into the circle. No set of footprints that approached from the trees, then joined the path. The first print on one side appeared in clean frost, surrounded by untouched ground. Across from it, on the other side of the tent, the ring ended the same way. It was as if whatever had made them had appeared, walked around our shelter, and then stepped out of existence again. We checked our own boots. The tread patterns didn't match exactly. These were similar, but deeper in some spots, narrower in others. Too small to be mine, too wide for one friend, wrong pattern for the other. There was no reason any of us would have spent time quietly circling our own tent while the others slept either. We had all been inside, listening the whole time. My chest tightened with the memory of that humming pressure. For a second, I imagined those 3 pale orbs, not as formless lights, but as something standing just beyond the edge of our understanding, walking the circle, studying the thin nylon barrier between us and the open air. We didn't say much while we packed up. The jokes we might usually make never arrived. We took the tent down quickly, shook off the frost, rolled the bags, shoved everything into the car with the practiced, clumsy speed of people who want to be somewhere else as soon as possible. As we drove back down the ridge, I watched the trees flick past in the side window and tried to fit the night into some category that didn't make my skin crawl. A weird atmospheric thing, plus some strangers' footprints from earlier, a trick of tired minds and half-frozen phones. The problem was, no matter how I arranged the pieces, there was always something left over that didn't fit. The others and I didn't talk about it much after that. A few times, one of them would bring it up when we were hanging out, just a throwaway line. "Remember that time on the ridge?" And then we'd all go quiet. It's like none of us wanted to say too much out loud in case speaking it gave it more weight, more reality. But sometimes at night, when I'm walking my dog and I catch myself about to whistle that familiar pattern, I stop. The sound sticks in my throat. I remember the frozen time on my phone, the humming in my chest, and that careful ring of footprints in the frost. If something up there on that ridge borrowed our time for a couple of hours, it let us leave afterward. That should be a comfort. Instead, it feels like a choice was made that had nothing to do with us. And that scares me more than anything we actually saw. You ever see somebody so clearly your brain just files them as normal person, and only later you realize they couldn't have been there at all? That's what happened to me down on Laurel Fork, and it still bothers me that the only one watching out for us might have been dead. My name is Eugene, and I've spent enough time around rivers to know they don't care how confident you feel. I like the kind of creeks that make you work a little to reach them, where you lose cell service before you even unbuckle your seatbelt. Laurel Fork in Tennessee is like that. You pull off onto a small gravel patch that doesn't look like much, and then a narrow footpath drops you down into the trees. At first, it's just woods. Leaves, roots, that slightly soft ground where you know it's going to be muddy after rain. Then, all at once, the sound hits you. Fast water, over rock, louder than it has any right to be for a creek you still can't see. It's a constant white noise, like static turned up, and it swallows smaller sounds so quick you almost stop trying to listen for anything else. The trail pinches into a rhododendron tunnel near the bottom. The branches on both sides lean in and knit together, their dark, waxy leaves blocking most of the sky. Light gets swallowed in there. It becomes this flat, greenish dimness where you can't really tell what time it is, just that it isn't full night yet. When a breeze pushes through up top, you feel it more than you see it. A slight shift in the air that doesn't quite reach your skin. Then the tunnel spits you out on the riverbank. Laurel Fork, at that spot, is narrow but busy. The water runs cold and clear when the weather's good, churning over rocks and dropping into sudden deeper pockets. The sound is a steady roar that smooths into a hiss if you stay long enough. The bank where we set up was a mix of slick boulders and gravel, with roots from bigger trees exposed like ribs where the creek had eaten away at the soil. Old waterlogged trash was tangled in those roots. Faded cans, bits of white foam, a brown plastic bottle crushed flat. None of it recent, all of it stained to the same dull color by time. We set our tent back from the water line, just far enough that a normal rise wouldn't touch it. There was a strip of flat ground barely big enough for it, framed by rocks on one side and dense brush on the other. It felt tucked in, almost sheltered, with the creek stretching along the front like a restless wall. The plan was simple. 2 days of fishing, campfires at night, back to normal life after. The first day went exactly that way. We waded cautiously, feeling with our boots for the slick spots, testing each step before putting full weight down. The water was so cold it made my shins ache through the waders. Each cast landed in pockets where the current slowed, lines drifting and tightening, the tip of the rod bending in small, hopeful ways that usually turned into nothing. We didn't talk much while we were out in the water. You can't really with the creek that loud unless you want to shout every sentence. Mostly it was small gestures, pointing at a good run or giving a thumbs up from a distance. The sun came through the canopy in narrow beams at weird angles, hitting the spray and making parts of the creek look like broken mirrors while leaving other parts in shadow. It was toward late afternoon, when the light starts to go flat and the air cools fast, that I saw him. I was climbing out of the creek, boots scraping on slippery stone, when something across the water caught my eye. On the opposite bank, just beyond where the rhododendron started, an old man was standing and looking in our direction. He wasn't moving. That was the first strange thing. He stood there with his arms at his sides, shoulders square, facing us directly. He had on dark pants, pulled a little high, a plaid shirt buttoned all the way up, and one of those short-brimmed hats older men wear in black and white photos. His clothes looked dated, not in a vintage fashion way, more like he'd walked out of some old family picture album. "Evening," I called, raising a hand. The creek tried its best to swallow my voice, but I know sound carries oddly along water. I expected at least a nod back. Instead, the old man stayed exactly as he was. No wave, no tilt of the head. From where I stood, I couldn't make out details of his face. His hat brim threw his eyes into shadow, but the impression that he was looking right at us sat heavy in my chest. My friend turned to follow my gaze. We both lifted a hand in that automatic outdoor courtesy gesture, the universal, "We see you, it's all good." After a moment, the old man lifted one of his arms. It was the way he did it that made my skin crawl. The movement was slow, too slow for how little distance his arm actually traveled. His elbow barely bent. His wrist turned at an angle that didn't look comfortable. Fingers not splayed in a normal wave, but hanging together in a loose, stiff line. It was like watching someone imitate a wave after seeing it once, without understanding what makes it look natural. Creepy, my friend muttered, just loud enough for me to catch over the water. Probably a local, I said, trying to make it sound casual, just making sure we're not trashing the place. We started hauling gear back toward the tent. I glanced down once to steady my footing on a slick rock. When I looked up again, the opposite bank was empty. There hadn't been enough time for him to walk far. Not at that careful speed he'd moved his arm. The rhododendrons behind him were thick, the kind of brush that catches your clothes and makes progress slow and noisy. We hadn't heard branches snap or leaves rustle. One second he was there, the next he wasn't. We made comments about it around the fire that night. Light jokes, the kind meant to put a little distance between you and the thing that unsettled you. Got our own river guardian, stuff like that. If either of us was really bothered, we didn't say so. The creek filled the spaces between our words, constant and unbothered. When we crawled into the tent, that sound wrapped around us. It's strange trying to sleep beside a creek like that. There's no quiet moment where you can hear the world reset between sounds. It's one endless rush, like static from an old TV. At some point in the night, I woke up and lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, convinced I could hear something different layered under the water. A slower, heavier splash repeating. But the longer I listened, the more it blended back into the uniform roar. The next day followed the same pattern. Fish, cold legs, careful footing, and little shafts of sunlight breaking through at odd times to light up the water in moving patches. We fished longer, settled into the rhythm of casting and retrieving, talking with our hands more than our voices. Right around dusk, he was back. Same spot, same clothes, same rigid posture. I saw him first this time and felt my stomach drop in a way I couldn't explain. There he was, in that exact patch of ground between two thick rhododendron clumps, as if he'd been dropped back into place. The light was flatter, shadows deeper, but the outline of him was unmistakable. My friend turned, followed my stare, and his face changed the moment he saw what I was looking at. "Hey!" I shouted louder than before. "You doing okay over there?" The water tore my words apart. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't cup a hand to his ear or lean closer. He just watched. Then once again, he lifted that arm in that slow, strange arc. The hand hung too long before turning back down. "You want to come over?" my friend yelled. "We got coffee on this side." I don't know why he said that. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe he felt like we were being rude just standing there, staring. Either way, the man's response was the same. Nothing. No nod, no step forward. After a few seconds, he lowered his arm, turned his whole body with the same careful stiffness, and stepped sideways into the rhododendron wall. He didn't push branches aside or duck. He just moved, and the greenery swallowed him without shaking. "Should we go see?" my friend asked. I looked at the fast water between us, the slick stones, the fading light. The opposite bank rose sharper than our side, with places where the rocks dropped off suddenly just under the surface. Crossing there at dusk, in cold, pushing water, to chase someone who clearly didn't want to come talk felt like asking for trouble. "We don't know what the footing's like over there," I said. If he needed help, he'd be yelling, not just watching. It sounded logical, and maybe it was, but it also gave me an excuse not to test the line between our bank and his. We stayed put, and eventually the conversation turned back to other things. Still, my eyes flicked to that spot across the creek every few minutes, until dark made everything into a flat wall. Sometime in the night, the rain started. At first, it blended right into the creek noise, just a slightly different tone. Then it got harder, enough that you could feel each drop in the tent fabric and smell the change in the air. That damp, heavy scent that says everything is getting saturated at once crept in under the edges. I woke to my friend's hand pressing my shoulder. "Water's coming up," he said low. We unzipped the tent and peered out. The beam of a flashlight cut through the drizzle and bounced off the surface of the creek. It wasn't that clear greenish color anymore. It had gone brown and thick, foam forming around rocks that had been almost dry by evening. The line between wet and dry stone had definitely moved closer to us. Flash floods don't care how comfortable your setup is. All it takes is a few miles of heavy rain upstream, and everything funnels down into the same tight channel. You go from ankle deep to chest deep faster than your brain wants to accept. "How bad do you think it'll get?" he asked. "I don't want to find out while we're down here," I said. We decided to move. Not panic, but urgency. Toss what we could into packs. Leave anything not worth the risk if we had to. Get up that narrow footpath before the creek turned mean. The rain made every rock feel like glass. The thought of that water suddenly being at the tent door was enough to push us into motion. On our last trip from the tent toward the trail, I made the mistake of looking across the creek. He was there. Same place, same stance, same clothes, though the low light and rain muddied the colors. The water behind him was higher now, lapping at rocks that had been completely out of it before. Spray misted around his lower legs, but he looked untouched by it. He was watching us again. Somehow that was worse now. Before, it had been strange. Now, with the creek swelling and the air buzzing with that particular tension storms bring, it felt like being evaluated. My friend saw him too and stopped beside me. The old man lifted his arm. The movement was identical. Slow, too wide at the wrist, like a recording being played back at the exact same speed. This time, when his arm reached that uncomfortable angle, he held it there for a beat, then turned his head, not toward us but upstream, toward a bend we couldn't see from our angle. Just a small tilt, but deliberate. Something in my chest snapped into focus. "Go," I said to my friend. "Now." We didn't argue about it. We climbed, boots slipping on mud, grabbing at roots and trunks to keep from going backward. The rhododendron tunnel was a blur of wet leaves and panting breath. The creek's roar grew fainter as we gained height, but it never quite dropped away, just shifted down into a heavier, more distant register. By the time we reached the car, we were soaked through and breathing hard. We threw gear in without our usual care for what went where, slammed the doors, and sat there with the rain hammering the roof. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. "You saw him again, right?" my friend asked. "I'm not losing it." "I saw him," I said. "Same as before." "Did he look wet to you?" he asked. I thought about it. The bank around him had glistened, slick in our light. Water had been moving fast behind him, but I couldn't remember seeing drops beating on his shoulders, no dark streaks running off the brim of his hat. His clothes had looked darker, but they hadn't clung or shone the way ours did. "I don't know," I said. "I really don't." We drove back toward town in that wired silence that settles in after adrenaline. The road wound through trees that looked like a single dark wall on both sides. Water rushed in ditches and culverts, popping out every so often in small cascades that flashed in the headlights. The first gas and bait kind of store we hit had its lights on, so we pulled in. Inside smelled like coffee concentrate and old wood. The guy behind the counter nodded at our drenched clothes and made some comment about the creek getting feisty. We laughed the way people do when they've just sidestepped something and don't want to look directly at it yet. I wandered over to a bulletin board of flyers, then up to a row of old photos in mismatched frames. Fishermen grinning, kids holding up stringers, groups posing along banks that all looked vaguely similar. One faded color photo caught me and pulled my eyes in. It showed an older man and a younger guy on a rocky creek bank. The older man wasn't looking straight at the camera. He was turned a little toward the water, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Plaid shirt buttoned to the top, pants hiked up a bit too high. The way he held himself, the straight line of his shoulders, the tension in his wrist, it all hit me at once. "Hey," I said to the owner. "Who's this?" He came over, squinted up at the frame, then nodded. "That there is Harper," he said. "Old-timer who used to about live down on Laurel Fork. Fish that bend near the Rotos every chance he got." "Is he around?" I asked, stupid question already forming as I said it. The owner snorted a little. "Not unless you count the stories," he said. "He drowned out there before I was born. Water came up fast one night. He camped low, didn't make it out. Folks around here like to say he still keeps an eye on that stretch when the creek's up. My dad swore he saw him once when he was a kid. I felt the hair on my arm stand up under my damp sleeves. When the creek's up, I repeated. Yeah, he said. You boys were down that way, near the bend? Which bend? I asked, already knowing. He made a little arc motion with his hand. Tight curve, rock wall on one side, gravel bar on the other. Rhodos, thick as sin, across from camp spots. Easy to get in trouble there if you're not careful. My mouth went dry. That's where we were, I said. He gave a small, knowing nod. Then I'd say somebody did you a favor getting you out before it really let loose, he said. Back in the car, my friend just stared through the windshield for a while. So, are we saying we got saved by a ghost fisherman? He asked finally. I don't know what we got saved by, I said. I just know there was an old man on the safe side of the water, pointing his head toward the danger, and that we moved a lot faster after seeing him than we would have otherwise. Since that trip, I haven't found a comfortable box to put it in. I don't like calling him a guardian because that makes it sound neat and comforting, and nothing about that moment felt comforting. I don't like calling him a ghost either, because that word is loaded with all kinds of nonsense this didn't have. He didn't float, he didn't glow, he just stood there like a real person who happened to be out of place in time. What sticks with me most is this. We were down on that gravel strip because we chose it. He was on the other side because something had put him there long before us. When the water turned ugly, the only one clearly watching the whole picture wasn't one of us. If I ever go back to Laurel Fork, I know exactly where my eyes will go first. Across the creek, through the rhododendron tunnel, to that patch of bank. And if I see an old man standing there in outdated clothes, not answering when I shout, just lifting his hand in that slow, wrong wave, I'm not going to wait around to figure out what he is. I'm going to start packing. You ever write something down as a joke and then feel the air change around you like you just agreed to something you don't understand? That's what happened to me the night I signed my name in Shelter Log 17. My name is Kiana, and a couple of years ago I decided to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail. I wasn't out there to find myself or chase some big revelation. I just wanted months of walking, trees, and the kind of tired that comes from using your body instead of your brain. By the time I hit the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina, I'd already been on trail for weeks. My world had shrunk to miles, food, weather, and where I was going to sleep. The day this happened, the weather turned on me early. A gray ceiling closed over the ridge, and the air got that thick feeling it gets right before a long, determined rain. The forecast I'd skimmed in town had said chance of showers. Out there, chance turned into guarantee fast. By mid-afternoon, the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was straight sheets of water, hammering the canopy, then cutting through it. The trail became a shallow stream almost immediately. Mud sucked at my shoes. Every step made a wet, squelching sound. My pack cover drummed with the constant hit of drops. It was one of those rains that doesn't give you a break to adjust your hood or wipe your face. You just deal with being wet everywhere, inside and out. I knew there was a shelter a day's hike from the last road crossing, one of those three-sided lean-tos the AT is dotted with. I'd planned to camp a little past it. When the rain really settled in, I changed my mind. A roof and some kind of platform sounded better than trying to pitch a tent in a storm and sleep in a puddle. By the time I saw the blue-blazed side path for the shelter, my legs were tired in that dull, deep way that comes from fighting mud all day. The little sign pointing toward it was faded and tilted, letters half worn away. The side trail dropped off the main ridge into thicker trees, switchbacking down just enough that my knees complained. Water ran down it in thin ribbons. I followed the paint blazes like breadcrumbs, counting my steps and listening for any sound that wasn't rain and my own breath. The shelter appeared all at once through the trees. A dark, low shape with a metal roof, set back in a small flat spot cut into the slope. The front was open to the trail. The inside, a raised wooden platform deep enough for half a dozen people if they liked each other. The roof extended over the front by a few feet, creating a drip line where water poured off in a steady sheet. I stopped under that overhang, dropped my pack to the slick, muddy ground, and just stood there for a second, letting my shoulders uncoil. The sound of the rain on the tin roof was loud enough to almost be a physical force. It boomed and rattled, then softened into a constant roar. Every few seconds, water dripped from the old beams inside, hitting the floor with irregular plinks that somehow cut through the overall noise. "Hello?" I called into the dim interior. My voice sounded small against the storm. I clicked on my headlamp, the dim yellow beam cutting a tunnel into the gloom. The shelter was empty. No gear spread out. No sleeping bag, no boots lined up. Just the platform, scarred with carved initials and little doodles, and the back wall dark with old moisture and smoke stains. The smell hit me as I stepped up. Wet wood, old smoke, and that faint sourness of mouse droppings and damp fabric people had used here before. It wasn't a bad smell, exactly. Just lived in. Heavy. I'd slept in worse. I unrolled my pad and bag in one corner and swapped my soaked shirt for something dry from the pack, shivering a little as the cold air hit my bare skin. Even with the rain pounding inches above my head, it felt safer than being out under the trees. The storm turned the rest of the forest into an indistinct blur just beyond the edge of shelter light. The trail in front was already a muddy ribbon, water flowing down it in a thin, determined stream. On the front post of the shelter, someone had nailed a small wooden box with a hinged lid. It was swollen from years of moisture, the edges dark and soft, but the nail still held it in place. Black marker on the front said, in shaky letters, "Logbook." Inside, on most of the AT, shelters have these journals people write in. Notes, jokes, weather tips, mileage flex, sometimes very honest middle-of-nowhere confessions. I've always liked reading them. There's something strangely comforting about seeing other people's handwriting in the same spot where you're sitting, especially after hours of not talking to anyone. I pried the box open. The little latch stuck for a second, then gave with a squelch. Inside was a battered composition book, cover peeling, pages fat and wavy from moisture. A pen on a piece of string was looped through the spiral binding. When I opened the book, some of the pages clung to each other, making a soft tearing sound as they separated. The first few entries were what you'd expect. Great night here, owls were loud, pushed big miles, feet hurt, but the view was worth it. Saw a bear on the ridgeline, hung my food extra careful. Trail names, dates, little sketches of mountains or stick figure hikers. My headlamp beam made the ink shine for a second before it dulled back down. The rain on the roof kept up its relentless percussion. Then, a name started repeating. It wasn't a name I recognized from my own days of leapfrogging with people. It looked more like a regular first name, not a quirky trail handle. The first time it showed up, it was just normal. Made it to the shelter. Raining like crazy. Feet like prunes. A few pages later. Something followed me from the last shelter. Heard steps behind me on the trail all night. No headlamps when I turned, no voices. Probably just my brain being weird, writing it anyway. The handwriting was neat but had a slight tilt, like whoever wrote it had been cold or tired. The pen had left deeper grooves in some letters, as if their hand had pressed harder without meaning to. Entry after that. Heard it again on the ridge, steps in sync with mine, then out of sync. Stopped when I stopped. Started again when I moved. If you're reading this behind me and you hear it too, please write it down so I know I'm not nuts. Rain hammered the roof harder for a second, then settled back. I shifted on the platform, the old wood creaking under my weight. My headlamp threw my own shadow long across the floorboards. The entries kept going, not every page, but often enough that a pattern formed. The same name, the same slant of letters. Stayed in the last shelter with two nobos, One said he thought he saw someone with a hood standing just off the trail while he was peeing. No headlamp. Too tall. Gone when he turned his light on fully. Can't shake the feeling I'm not alone out here even when I know I am. Heard breathing last night outside the shelter wall, but the leaves were dry. No footsteps coming or going. If this is you reading this and you felt any of this, please write, even just a yes. The pages were warped enough that some words had bled a little, but the meaning came through. A small part of my brain whispered that maybe it was an elaborate prank, someone building a story for fun, but the entries were spread over weeks, with other hikers' names and notes threaded between them. Weather changed in the comments. People mentioned different trail conditions. Then came the one that made me pause. Found this log again after thinking it was all in my head. It's still behind me. I don't see it, but I feel it. Woke up last night in another shelter and heard something drag its hand along the wall, fingertip to fingertip, right where my head was, slow as it could go. Nobody else signed in. If you joke about this in here, I hope you never hear that sound. If you believe me, keep an eye out. I don't think it likes to be ignored. A date was scrawled under that line, months old. Long enough that whoever wrote it was far away by now, or had gone home, or moved on with life, or whatever happens after the trail ends for someone. I sat there, listening to the storm thud and rattle on the roof, and realized I'd been holding my breath while reading. I let it out and laughed, but it came out thin and a little too high. Okay, I said out loud, just to break the quiet. Creepy story, mystery hiker, 10 out of 10. The pen on its string tapped lightly against the page when I moved the book. I thought about closing it and just signing my name like normal, next date in the line. Instead, some stupid bored part of me decided to lean into the mood. I flipped to a mostly empty line under that last entry, where the ink had stopped mid-page. The paper there was swollen and rough. My handwriting looked clumsier than usual as I wrote, "Hey, mystery stalker person, I'll keep an eye out for your shadow tonight. If I hear any wall scratching, I'll tell it to move along. Kiana." I added a tiny, dumb, smiley face I regretted the second the pen left the page. The joke looked flat in the yellow headlamp light. It felt like laughing too loud in a quiet room. For a second, nothing happened, of course. The shelter didn't shudder. The air didn't drop 10 degrees. The rain just kept slamming into the roof, a solid numbing noise. But the weight of seeing my own name under those other entries made a knot form in my stomach. I put the pen back, closed the logbook, and slid it into its warped wooden box, pushing the lid down until it caught. Then I turned back to my corner, crawled into my bag, and tried to tell myself I was just tired and letting some old scribbles get into my head. Night on trail, alone in a shelter, hits different than night in a tent. In a tent, you're in your own little fabric bubble. You hear sounds, but you can pretend they're far away. In a 3-sided wooden box, everything feels closer. The darkness outside is pressed right up against the open front. Every gust of wind, every drip from the trees, every rustle in the leaves feels like it's right there, because it is. The rain went on and on. No break, no lull. It felt like being inside a drum someone wouldn't stop hitting. The floor under my mat was slightly uneven. I could feel where boards had warped over time. The smells of wet wood and old smoke and mice didn't fade either. They just became the air. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. Through hiker exhaustion eventually overrides everything. When I woke up again, it wasn't because the storm had stopped. It was because something had changed in the way the sound filled the space. The rain was still going, but my brain had grown used to it. What cut through now was a different noise entirely. It started so softly I almost missed it. A faint, dry scrape on the outside wall, near where my head was. The back wall of the shelter was only a few feet from me. Rough boards, dark with age, carved up with initials and dates. Behind it, the hill rose steeply, earth held back by whatever stones and roots had been there when someone decided this was a good place for a lean-to. There was a narrow gap between the wall and the hill, maybe big enough for something small to move in. The sound came again. A dragging friction, not sharp enough to be claws, not rough enough to be stone. It moved horizontally, inching along at a steady pace. It reminded me, horribly clearly, of the sound my own fingers made when I trailed them along a fence as a kid, fingertips on wood. Rain pounded the roof. Water dripped from a beam near my feet. Somewhere under all that, a hand slid along the outside of the shelter wall, slow and deliberate, like whoever it belonged to had all the time in the world. I froze. My breath hitched, and then stopped entirely for a few seconds. Every instinct screamed to sit up and twist around, to lift the headlamp and flood the back wall with light. But there was another, older instinct that said, move less, listen more. The dragging traveled the length of the wall behind my head. It paused when it reached roughly where my shoulders were, then resumed, going past my hips, down toward where my feet were. The boards creaked just slightly with the pressure, the way they do when you lean against them from the outside. My mind did what minds do in moments like that, grabbed for explanations. Big rodent? No. The sound was too straight, too smooth, not the stop-and-go scuttle of a mouse or a rat. A branch pushed by the wind? No. The storm was slamming the roof, but the air inside the shelter was mostly still. Besides, branches scraping wood have that uneven catching quality. This was patient. The dragging stopped near the lower corner of the wall. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but rain and my heart pounding in my ears. I slowly let a breath out between my teeth, barely letting my chest move. I was suddenly, stupidly aware of the exact words I'd written in the log. I'll keep an eye out for your shadow tonight. The scraping started again. This time, it moved upward, from the lower wall toward the top, as if a hand had found the corner and wanted to trace it. The tips of whatever was making contact pressed just enough to make the wood groan faintly. The pace never changed. It was unhurried, steady, like someone walking their fingers along a line. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached slowly, very slowly for my headlamp where it sat beside me. The elastic strap felt cold and damp under my fingers. I slipped it over my forehead with care, trying not to let the plastic housing knock against the wood. The scraping paused as the band brushed my hair. I lay there, body rigid, thumb hovering over the button. The rain drummed and rattled. A drop of water fell from a beam and hit my wrist. The sound behind the wall held its breath with me. Then, as if it had made up its mind, the dragging resumed. This time, it moved downward, directly behind where my face was turned toward the wall. I imagined fingers spread, pressing lightly, moving in a slow, straight line. I hit the light. The inside of the shelter burst into harsh yellow. Graffiti, carved hearts, dates, and dirty boot prints swam into view. The back wall was just boards, wet in places where the roof had leaked over the years, dark with old smoke. No gap wide enough for anything my size. Just a small space between wood and dirt. The scraping stopped instantly. The only sounds left were the storm and the tiny, irregular drips from the beams. I swung the beam across the floor, the open front, the corners. Nothing. Mud outside, already turning into a shallow pond. The trail leading away was just a brown, churning line. "Hello?" I said, hating how tight my voice sounded. The storm answered for the world. I stayed sitting up for a long time, light still on, heart racing in little aftershocks. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me down again. It's hard to explain, but even with what I'd heard, my body insisted on sleep. The light went off to save the battery. The darkness came back, thick and complete. I didn't hear the scraping again. Or if I did, my brain refused to wake me for it. Morning came in a gray smear. The rain had finally eased to a mist. The forest outside the shelter looked washed out and tired. Clouds still leaned heavy over the ridge, but the violence of the storm was gone. The air smelled cleaner, sharper, like everything had been rinsed. I packed slowly, stretching muscles that felt like they'd been clenched all night. My mind kept circling back to the sound on the wall, trying to convince itself I'd dreamed it. The more I replayed it, the less dreamlike it felt. Before leaving, I went back to the logbook. The wooden box was damp, but the hinge moved without complaint. The notebook inside looked the same, swollen, edges frayed. I flipped it open, thumbing quickly to the page where I'd written my little joke the night before. My entry was there, my name under the older one, the tiny smiley face I wished I'd never drawn. Underneath it, in a slightly different ink, a new line had appeared. Thank you for watching with me. Same neat tilt of handwriting as the previous hiker's entries. Same pressure in the pen strokes. It sat directly beneath my own words, close enough that the descenders of my letters almost touched its ascenders. There was no date, no name, just that sentence. My stomach turned over. I flipped ahead a few pages, then back. No other new notes. No fresh scrawl from some joker who might have snuck in while I slept. The mud outside the shelter, what hadn't washed away completely, showed only one set of boot prints between the trail and the platform. Mine. No lighter, newer imprints. No pattern that suggested someone had stood at the entrance and written quickly before leaving. I stood there, with the book open in my hands, the damp edges soaking a little moisture into my fingers, and felt something I hadn't really felt on the trail up to that point. The sense that I had stepped into someone else's story without meaning to. Maybe it was an elaborate setup, some long-running prank between hikers. Maybe someone had written that line weeks earlier, and I'd just not noticed the difference in ink until that moment. Maybe there was another set of prints I'd missed on the softer ground beyond my little patch of mud. But I couldn't shake the memory of that dragging sound on the wall. The pacing. The way it paused when I moved. The way it traced the length behind my head and then the corner. I closed the logbook carefully, slid it back into its box, and snapped the lid shut. For the first time on trail, I didn't sign with my usual note about miles and weather. My name was already in there, printed under a promise I hadn't understood when I wrote it. Back on the muddy trail, as I hiked away, the rain picked up again, though it never reached the fury of the night before. My boots made soft, sucking sounds in the wet ground. Every so often, I looked back, half expecting to see someone standing near the shelter, at the edge of the trees, watching. No one was there. I passed other shelters in the days after, some full of people, some empty and echoing. The logbooks were always there, fat with names and notes and doodles. I flipped through them, but I never looked long enough to see if that same handwriting showed up somewhere else. I didn't leave more jokes. I signed fast, just trail name and date, and closed the covers. Sometimes, back home now, I'll see a guestbook at a cabin or a cafe and feel my hand itch for a pen. Then I remember Shelter Log 17, my own handwriting under someone else's fear, and that single line that appeared overnight. Thank you for watching with me. It felt, in that empty shelter, with its dripping beams and soaked wood, less like gratitude and more like acknowledgement. Like whatever had been tracing its fingers along the wall had noticed that, for one stormy night, it wasn't the only one awake and listening. You ever talk just to hear your own echo, and then realize something else is talking back through it? That night, under the rock overhang in West Virginia, it felt like the hollow had been waiting a long time for someone to answer. My name is Bethany, and I've always liked the sound of my own voice in strange places. Tunnels, stairwells, parking garages. If there's an echo, I'm the idiot who's going to test it. When I started doing more solo backpacking, that habit came with me. It's stupid, but when you spend a lot of time alone in the woods, hearing your own words bounce back makes you feel a little less like you're the last person on Earth. The plan for that weekend was simple. 2 nights in the Monongahela backcountry, nothing fancy. I'd picked a primitive site I'd seen once before on a day hike. tucked up under a sandstone overhang on the side of a hollow. No fire ring, no sign, nothing official. Just a spot where the rock jutted out enough to keep the ground underneath mostly dry, even in rain. It felt like a little cave that never fully committed. The day I hiked in was cold but clear. Breath fogged in front of my face on the climbs, and the leaf litter crunched under my boots. The trail wound along a ridge, then dropped in a series of lazy switchbacks toward a shallow stream bed. The trees thinned out a little near the rock outcrop, the ground going from soil and roots to more bare stone. The hollow itself was quieter than the ridge. Sound behaved differently there. My footsteps seemed to come back to me half a beat later, from somewhere up under the overhang. When I spoke to myself, just a quick, "There it is," when I saw the familiar curve of sandstone, the words bounced back thinner, and a fraction delayed. Not a strong canyon echo, just a ghost of one. The overhang was bigger than I remembered. From the outside, it looked like someone had sliced a chunk out of the hillside with a knife, leaving a shallow cave facing the trees. The ceiling sloped down toward the back, streaked with darker mineral lines and dotted with little knobs of stone. The floor under it was mostly dry, covered in a thin layer of old leaves and fine powdery dust from years of slow crumbling. I set my pack down on the flattest patch and just listened for a minute. Outside, small insects and the occasional bird were making their end-of-day noises. Inside the hollow, those sounds came in softer, filtered. Every drip from a tiny crack in the ceiling that managed to collect enough moisture to let go hit the rock with a sharp, distinct tick that carried farther than it should have. Even my clothes shifting, nylon brushing nylon, seemed louder under there. I got a small fire going right at the edge of the overhang where the smoke could wander out instead of up. The flames painted the rock ceiling in moving shadows, making the mineral streaks look like something crawling slowly overhead. The heat rolled backward into the shelter and took the worst edge off the cold. The smell of damp leaves warmed by the fire mixed with the clean, almost metallic scent of cold stone. I didn't see another person all afternoon. No voices on the trail, no distant dog barks, nothing. That particular hollow felt farther from the world than the actual miles on the map said it was. As the light slid away and the fire became the only real source of warmth and color, boredom did what it always does with me. It pushed me to make noise. At first it was just humming, a tune stuck in my head from before the trip, nothing special. The hollow picked it up and sent it back a little altered, thinned out, and tinnier. Then I said something out loud, half joking. "Testing, testing," I called. "Testing, testing," came back, the second word clipped, as if the rock hadn't liked the extra syllable. I smiled. "Okay, that's kinda cool." "Okay, that's kinda cool," it answered, flatter, as if spoken through someone else's teeth. I threw another small stick on the fire and watched the sparks climb. The echo wasn't strong, but it existed, and that was enough to kick my brain into play mode. "What do you want?" I called, grinning to myself. "What do you want?" came back, but the want stretched a little longer than I'd said it. The vowel pulled thin. I tried a longer sentence next. "It's just me out here tonight." "It's just me out here tonight," the hollow replied, but there was a tiny hitch before me, like something had almost said a different word first and then caught itself. I told myself I was hearing things. Echoes are messy. They bounce off uneven surfaces, cancel each other, smear timing. You can load a lot of meaning into a simple audio glitch when you're primed to listen for it. Still, I kept going. "This place is beautiful," I said. "This place is beautiful," it agreed, though the trailing L blurred into something that sounded closer to a breath than a consonant. I decided to test it. "Echoes don't talk back," I called, enunciating each word. "Echoes don't talk," came the return. My skin prickled along my arms. I hadn't dropped the back. I knew I hadn't. I'd said it clear, the CKs at the end punching out into the firelight. The hollow had trimmed it. That was how my brain framed it anyway, because the alternative was worse. "Lucky coincidence," I muttered. Lucky, came a soft repeat, too fast to be a proper echo now, more like someone parroting the last thing they caught. I stared at the dark mouth of the hollow for a long second, suddenly very aware of how the firelight only reached so far before it surrendered to deep shadow. The back wall was just a suggestion of darker black. Anything could have been sitting there, hunched, watching, and I would have never known. I tried to shake it off. It was sound on rock, nothing more. "If you're real, say something original," I said, mostly to prove to myself that the only words coming back were mine, bent and thinned. The hollow stayed quiet. The fire popped. One of the tiny mineral drips landed somewhere to my left with its sharp little tick. "Didn't think so," I said, forcing a low laugh. "Didn't think," came the beginning of a response, then cut itself off midway, like someone stopping mid-word. That was the first moment I thought, I might be in over my head here. The insects outside, which had been a constant low chatter, cut off all at once. It was like somebody had thrown a blanket over the world beyond the overhang. The shift was instant and total. Even the small night sounds, shifts in the leaves, a branch creak, seemed to hold their breath. The silence poured into the hollow hard enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I swallowed. "Okay," I said softer. "That's enough." Nothing answered. I let the fire die down a little, more out of neglect than choice. My mind was looping through options. Keep playing, shut up, and pretend nothing happened. Pack up in the dark and hike out. None of them felt great. The idea of leaving meant stepping out of the circle of light into a forest that had just gone unnaturally quiet. The idea of talking more meant inviting something. Finally, because being afraid without information feels worse to me than doing something stupid, I decided to ask directly. "Who's there?" I called. The hollow didn't respond right away. The question went out, hit the back wall, and seemed to vanish instead of bouncing. The fire crackled. My own breath steamed faintly in the cold air. I was about to laugh at myself for being dramatic when a voice answered. Not from the overhang, from just beyond the firelight, off to my right, in the dark between two trees. "It's me, B." My entire body went cold. The voice wasn't distorted. It wasn't thin or hollow. It didn't wobble with echo. It sounded exactly like my father. He has a very particular way of saying that nickname, stretching the single syllable just a hair, turning it into something soft. I hadn't heard that exact tone in years, not since before some family things got complicated and distance grew in ways that had nothing to do with Miles. He has never been to West Virginia. He doesn't camp. He thinks sleeping on the ground is something you grow out of when you can afford a decent mattress. "It's me, B," the voice said again, gentle, amused, the way he'd say it when I'd call him and ask who it was, even though I'd dialed him on purpose. My tongue felt glued to the roof of my mouth. I couldn't make a sound. Every rational part of me screamed that it had to be my own brain, pulling old audio files out and laying them over the night. But another part, the animal part, was already cataloging details. The direction it came from, the distance, the warmth in the tone, the lack of any other footstep or movement. "Dad?" I finally forced out. "Dad?" the hollow repeated a half-beat later, in my own voice, thin and flat. The copy of my father didn't say anything that time. I stood up without realizing I was moving, knees unsteady. The fire popped, throwing a small spray of sparks toward the dark. The rock face magnified the tiny noises of my boots on the floor, made every shift sound too loud. "Say something else," I said, my own voice shaking. "You always did like to hear yourself talk," the voice said, from the same patch of darkness. That was another one of his lines. He'd said almost that exact thing to me when I was a teenager, loud and opinionated. The timing, the cadence, even the tiny chuckle at the end matched a memory so closely that my eyes burned. But the words that came out of my mouth in the hollow, "You always did like to hear yourself talk," came back a moment later, stripped down as an echo. Two layers of the same sentence, one in my father's tone, one in mine, slightly out of sync. Something about that layering felt wrong in my bones. I did what I always do when I'm rattled. I tried to over-explain it. Sleep deprivation, I muttered. You've been alone too long. You read creepy stuff and now you're making echoes into people. People, came a faint repeat from the rock, followed by a soft tap from some drip hitting stone behind me. What do you want? I asked the dark. What do you want? The hollow answered, exactly this time, no edits. The father voice didn't answer that one. In fact, as soon as I directly addressed whatever was out there, it seemed to retreat a step, like it preferred sneaking in around the edges of casual talk instead of being called on. I realized I was standing half in, half out of the overhang, right at the line where the firelight faded into pure shadow. The air outside that circle felt thicker, like it had weight to it. My breath fogged more there too, little white clouds that vanished almost instantly. A new thought slid in, unwelcome. If something wanted to get me closer to the dark, what better voice to use than the one most wired into childhood comfort? The idea landed hard enough that I physically stepped backward, deeper under the rock, until my shoulder blades brushed the rough wall. I'm not playing, I said, louder than I meant to. Whatever this is, we're done. Whatever this is, we're... The echo tried, but the last word blurred, as if the hollow had choked on it. Outside, the insects stayed silent. No rustle of something big in the leaves, no breeze in the branches, just the fire, my breathing, the occasional tick of a drip, and that strange waiting stillness. I made the decision then. I was leaving. Night hiking isn't my favorite, but I'd rather deal with the known hazards of a trail in the dark, roots, rocks, maybe a twisted ankle, than stay in a place where the air itself felt like it had opinions about me. I broke the fire down faster than I should have, kicking dirt over embers that still glowed cherry red. As the light died, the rock face swallowed the last shapes it had been holding. The overhang became just a darker patch of black against the slightly less dark sky. Behind me, from inside the hollow now, my father's voice said quietly, "Don't go yet." Every hair on my arm stood up. The sound had moved without footsteps, without shift. One moment it had been out among the trees. The next it was right there, behind my left shoulder, as if he were leaning against the same stone I was. I didn't answer. I swung my pack up with shaking hands, fumbled the straps on, and forced my legs to move. The crunch of my boots on the leaf litter sounded too small, swallowed by the hollow, and then thrown back at me in ragged pieces. The trail that had seemed straightforward in daylight now looked like a tangle of shadows. My headlamp beam carved a weak path through it, showing me one step at a time. Each rock and root became a potential trap. I placed my feet carefully, keeping my center of gravity low. About 20 yards from the overhang, just as the terrain started to slope back up toward the ridge, the voice came again. Not from behind this time, but from somewhere off to my left, deeper into the trees. Wait. I didn't turn toward it. Every horror movie I'd ever laughed at back home flashed through my mind in rapid cuts. I focused on the small circle of light in front of my toes and kept going. "You're not even going to say goodbye?" it asked, hurt layered into the tone exactly the way my father used when he was jokingly offended. Leaves rustled somewhere off the trail, not close enough to suggest something rushing me, just enough to confirm that whatever was making the sound could move. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it felt like it belonged to someone else. I wanted to say, "You're not him," out loud. I wanted to break whatever spell it was trying to cast by naming it. But another part of me worried that giving it that line, that acknowledgement, would make it sharper, more defined. So I stayed quiet. The climb back to the ridge felt 3 times longer than it had on the way down. My calves burned. My throat tasted metallic. Every time my beam hit a particular shape, a stump, a leaning tree, a big rock, I half expected to see a figure standing there. Familiar shoulders, familiar hat, familiar tilt of the head. Every time, it was just dead wood and stone. When I finally leveled out on the main trail, the forest sounds began to creep back in. A single insect started up its song, tentative at first, then more confident. Somewhere far off, an owl called once. The world resumed, like a conversation picking back up after an awkward pause. The hollow behind me stayed quiet. I didn't look back. I hiked until my legs shook with each step, then hiked a little more, putting as much distance between myself and that sandstone overhang as I could before my body simply refused to go on. When I finally did stop and throw my tent up almost carelessly in a flattish spot beside the trail, my hands were clumsy with fatigue and leftover adrenaline. Inside the tent, with the zipper mostly closed and the fabric around me glowing faintly from my headlamp, I felt a little less exposed. The sounds around me were normal again. Night insects, wind in the branches, the occasional shifting creak. Even so, I lay there for a long time, waiting to hear that voice slide in over the top of everything. "B," it finally whispered. It came from no clear direction. Not from one side of the tent, not from above, not from the ground. It felt like it came from the air itself, settling just behind my ears. My father's voice, turned down to a near murmur, the way he used to talk when he'd tuck me in as a kid thinking I was half asleep. "I'm proud of you," it said. That was the worst line of all, because it was the one I'd wanted to hear from him as an adult more than once and never quite had in those exact words. The echo in the hollow had gone from stealing bits of my sentences to digging into the deepest, most unguarded part of my memory and pulling out something I'd never heard but always wanted. I didn't answer. Tears slid sideways into my ears as I stared at the tent ceiling and tried to remind myself that nothing with my father's voice was actually out there. It was just an empty place that collected sound, and that something in it, or about it, had gotten very good at rearranging what it caught. Morning made everything smaller. The forest looked like forest again instead of a black wall. My tent was just nylon, not armor. The sky was a washed-out blue that promised a decent day. But when I packed up and started walking, I paid attention to every place where my voice might bounce. On later trips, whenever I found myself under an overhang or in a cave, I kept my mouth shut. No singing, no testing. I let the silence stay heavy. If someone else in the group tried it, I smiled and listened and didn't join in. Echoes are supposed to give you back what you put into them, nothing more. That's the whole point. You speak, you get the same thing returned. A little thinner, a little delayed. A harmless reminder that you exist in a space with edges. That night in the hollow, those edges felt like they were bending in toward me, listening harder than any rock should. People talk about the woods having voices. Wind through leaves, water over stone, animals calling to each other. Maybe sometimes, in certain places, something else is listening too. Something that doesn't have a mouth or a face, so it has to use yours. All I know is this. I went into that rock shelter thinking it would be fun to hear myself talk, and I left not entirely sure where my voice ended and something else's began. And somewhere out there, in a hollow I won't visit again, there's an overhang that knows the sound of my father's voice, even though he has never set foot in those mountains. You know that feeling when a place is supposed to be crowded, and the emptiness itself starts to feel like the threat. That's what happened to me up near Clingman's Dome, where the trail was full of signs that people had been there, except for the people. My name is Jerry, and if you've ever hiked near Clingman's Dome, you know it's not the kind of place you expect to have to yourself. It's the highest point on the Appalachian Trail, a magnet for day hikers and backpackers, even late in the season. When I planned that trip, I actually worried more about noisy camps and crowded shelters than anything spooky. A buddy and I had permits, a rough route, and the usual plan: push through the smoky section, hit the viewpoints if the weather cooperated, and get out feeling tired and satisfied. By the time we drove up toward the ridge, It already felt different. The parking lots we expected to see full were half empty. The air had that thin, high-elevation chill to it, even in the afternoon. Clouds hung low, dragging wisps through the trees at head height so that every few steps you'd walk through a little patch of fog like cigarette smoke and then out into clearer air again. We started from a popular access point, the kind of place where you usually hear car doors and kids arguing about jackets. That day, it was quieter. The trail climbed gently into spruce fir forest, and the smell changed from dusty leaf mold to that sharp, clean scent of resin and wet moss. The ground underfoot turned soft and spongy, a carpet of needles and thick moss that swallowed the sound of our boots. Up there, even normal noise feels muffled. We kept expecting to hear other hikers. Voices carry strangely in those woods. You can hear someone laughing from a ridge over and never actually see them. But as the first hour passed, then the second, it was just us and the wind moving in the tops of the trees. There was also that distant low drone you sometimes get up high, like an aircraft far away, constant enough that you start to ignore it. We never saw a plane. The first odd thing we noticed was a campsite just off the trail. It was the kind of spot that gets used a lot. Flat patch of earth, ring of stones for a fire, trees spaced just right for a couple of hammocks or a tent or two. From the trail, we could see a small gray tent still standing, door unzipped. A stove sat on a flat rock nearby with a pot on top. The moss around the site was disturbed with footprints, but no one called out when we approached. "Anyone home?" I said, out of habit, as we stepped off the trail. No answer. The thin wind sighed through the spruces overhead, and a strand of cloud slipped between the trunks at waist level. The air felt colder in the little clearing, like the trees were holding the chill in. The tent was empty. Sleeping bag laid out, a small pillow, pad still inflated. The kind of mess you'd leave if you just stood up to stretch or go to the bathroom. The pot on the stove was half full of something that had congealed into an unappetizing skin. The stove itself was off. No residual warmth when I held my hand near it. A plastic mug lay on its side in the moss, a dark ring where liquid had soaked in and dried. Maybe they went to get water, my friend said. We looked around for the usual signs. Blue-blazed side trail, beaten path toward a spring. There was one faint track leading downhill, but the mud there was smooth, no fresh prints punched into it. The moss on the rocks looked undisturbed. If someone had walked that way recently, they'd been light on their feet. Or maybe they bailed and left in a hurry, I said. Storm coming, something like that. Except there wasn't a storm. The sky was overcast, but the clouds were high, not the heavy, dark kind that mean business. The wind was steady, not gusting. It felt more like the world was holding its breath than building toward anything. I didn't like standing among someone else's things. It felt like stepping into a stranger's bedroom. We backed out, returned to the trail, and kept moving. The whole scene lodged in the back of my head, though, like a burr. As the day went on, we passed more signs that people had been there recently. Fresh boot prints in the damp patches of trail, the occasional snack wrapper someone had dropped, a trekking pole tip mark here and there. But we still didn't see or hear anyone. No hello from around a bend, no clack of poles, no music bleeding from someone's tiny speaker. Just that soft, constant wind, our breathing, and that distant low hum that never turned into anything visible. Another mile or two along, we came to a second camp. This one was larger, just off a junction where a side trail dropped toward a shelter. 4 or 5 tent sites ringed a central fire area. Half-burned logs sat in a circle, and under the ash I could see the dull red of retained heat. When I held my palm over it, the air was still faintly warm. Not hot, but more than ambient. Someone had had a fire there not long before. There were 2 tents. One stood open, door flopped back, gear scattered inside, clothes, a book, a headlamp. The other was zipped, but from the outside you could see the outline of a sleeping bag and pad through the thin fabric. A collapsible chair was set up facing the fire pit, a jacket slung over its back. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. The word disappeared into the trees. No answering shout, no rustle, no curse from someone tripping over a root on their way back. I don't like this, my friend said quietly. I didn't either, but I didn't want to say it out loud. I walked a slow circle around the site, scanning for notes. Sometimes rangers leave warnings if there's been a problem. Bear activity, weather issues, anything. There was nothing pinned to a tree or tucked under a rock. The bear cables hung empty, no food bags swaying in the breeze. What if there was an evacuation, my friend said. Like something happened and they pulled people out. We'd have seen or heard something, I said. A truck at a road crossing, a helicopter, more signage. And why would they leave gear? That stuff is expensive. We stood there a little too long. The moss at our feet felt thick and strangely springy, like stepping on a sponge. It muffled the sounds of our shifting weight, made me feel like even the trail wanted to erase evidence of us being there. Let's just get to our site, I said finally. Maybe we'll run into people near the shelters. We pushed on. The higher we got, the more the forest closed in. Spruce and fir trunks rose straight and close together, their bark dark and rough. The understory was bare in places. Just moss and lichen and the occasional deadfall. Low clouds drifted through, leaving beads of moisture on sleeves and hair, even though it technically wasn't raining. I kept an eye on the ground. The boot prints ahead of us were still there, multiple sizes, some deep, some light. They overlapped in places, like a whole crowd had gone through sometime earlier. But any time we reached a place where the trail opened into a viewpoint or junction, the space was empty. Sometime late in the afternoon, we realized we hadn't heard another human voice in almost the entire day. That's not normal, right? My friend asked. Late season, I said weakly. Maybe we just picked a weird day. He gave me a look that said he thought that explanation was thin, even as he nodded. Our campsite for the night was a small designated spot off the AT. It was marked on the map and in the guidebook, a place people used all the time. When we got there, it was exactly like the others we'd seen that day. Obviously used recently, obviously empty now. A flat tent pad held the imprint of a footprint in the dirt, crisp enough that the tread pattern was still sharp. A ring of stones contained the char of a past fire. A plastic spoon lay on the ground, half buried where someone had dropped it. The bear cables here had a single empty carabiner clipped to one line, swinging slightly in the breeze. We set up our tent because we didn't have many options. The light was fading, and the distance to the next site was more than we wanted to tackle with night creeping in. Cooking and eating felt wrong, though, like sitting down at a table someone else had just left mid-meal. We moved quietly without meaning to. The thin air up there has a way of making everything feel a little unreal. You can see farther on clear days, but on cloudy ones, the world shrinks to the reach of your headlamp and the outline of the nearest trees. That evening, wisps of cloud kept sliding silently through camp, brushing our faces like cold breath. We didn't build a fire. There was enough wind that keeping one going would have been more trouble than it was worth. Instead, we sat in the tent entryway, backs propped against our packs, and watched the trees sway while we ate. The forest should have felt alive. Instead, it felt like a photograph of itself. "Do you hear that plane?" my friend asked at one point. I listened. That low hum was still there, just at the threshold of hearing. A constant vibration you could almost feel in your chest if you focused on it. "Maybe," I said. "Could just be the wind over the ridge." "Wind doesn't sound like that," he said. "Not steady for this long." We crawled into the tent when the cold started to bite through our layers. Zipping the door shut didn't exactly make things safer, but it made the world smaller, and that helped. The ground under us was soft enough that my hip didn't complain. The spruce tips above whispered in the wind, telling each other something we weren't invited to understand. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Out there, time gets fuzzy. Without the context of town noise or clocks, you measure it in breaths and shifts and the way the darkness feels. I remember opening my eyes and instantly knowing something had changed. The hum was gone. The low drone that had been there all day, background to everything else, had vanished. The wind still moved through the trees, but it sounded thinner without that undercurrent, like a song missing its bass line. I lay there, listening, not sure what had pulled me from sleep. My friend's breathing beside me was slow and even. The tent fabric rustled occasionally as a small draft moved under it. For a moment, I thought maybe my brain had just decided to wake me up for no reason. Then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first. So faint, I almost dismissed them as my imagination. A soft, rhythmic thump, like someone placing boots carefully on the spongy trail. The ground around our site was padded with years of needles and moss, so even our own steps had been quiet. Still, there was a distinct pattern to this sound. Many feet, not in perfect sync, but overlapping, moving together. It came from the direction of the main trail above us, where a short spur connected our little campsite clearing to the AT. The sound grew clearer as it approached, the muffled impact of boots on soft earth, an occasional scuff against a hidden rock, the whisper of fabric brushing against branches. I held my breath. My friend rolled over, half awake, and froze when he heard it too. We both stayed absolutely still. The footsteps reached the junction where our spur met the main trail. They didn't turn toward us. Instead, they continued straight past, like a group moving along the ridge in the dark. Dozens of them. Too many for just a couple of hikers. The rhythm suggested a line, maybe. People following each other, some stepping a little harder, some lighter. No headlamps cut through the trees. No low conversation carried on the air. No one coughed, sniffled, cursed, or laughed. It was a parade of invisible boots, nothing more. The sound passed our campsite and faded a little as it moved away down the trail. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was total. No wind, no hum, no insects, though it was late in the year for them anyway. I could hear my heartbeat again, relentless in my own ears. A smell drifted in through the tent wall then, sharp and out of place. Not the usual mix of earth and damp and resin. This was metallic, cold, like the air in a machine room or the inside of a car left in the shade too long. It made my tongue tingle when I breathed through my mouth. It reminded me of biting a piece of aluminum foil by accident as a kid. My friend whispered, barely audible. "You smell that?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "What is it?" "I don't know." We lay there, waiting for something else to happen. For another round of footsteps, for a voice, for a flashlight beam cutting through the tent fabric. Nothing did. After a while, the normal noises of the forest began to creep back in. The wind resumed its quiet work in the branches. Somewhere far off, a small animal rustled through the undergrowth. Eventually, exhausted, we drifted back into a shallow, restless sleep. Morning at that elevation can feel brutally honest. The light is thin and cold, unforgiving. When we unzipped the tent and stepped out, the air burned the inside of my nose with every inhale. Wisps of fog clung close to the ground, curling around boots and roots. We climbed the short spur back up to the main trail, hearts pounding a little harder than altitude alone explained. The path looked the way it had the day before, a ribbon of dark earth between lighter moss and needles. But under the new scattering of night-fallen needles, there were prints, dozens of them. They went in one direction past our junction toward the next campsite and shelter area. Different sizes, different tread patterns. Some deep, some shallow. The kind of variety you see when a group has come through. Heavy packs, light day bags, all mixed together. They were fresher than the prints we'd seen the previous day. Edges clean, not softened by weather. There were no prints coming back the way they'd gone. I crouched down and touched one of the deeper impressions. The soil inside was just as cold as the ground around it. No residual warmth from the pressure of a body. The metallic tang in the air lingered faintly, less intense than at night, but still noticeable if you really breathed it in. Where did they all go? my friend asked quietly. Forward, I said, because that was the only direction the evidence supported. He looked down the trail into the trees. The spruce trunks stood close, dark, dressed in drapes of lichen. The path disappeared into them after a short curve. I mean after, he said. There should be people. We should have seen them. He was right. On a normal day, catching up to prints like that means running into the makers within an hour or two. People stop. They rest at rocks, viewpoints, water sources. They talk. That day, as we hiked on, we saw more empty sites. At the next one, 2 fire rings still held the faintest traces of heat under ash. If you held your palm close, you could feel the ghost of warmth. A pot hung from a rock tripod over one pit, empty, soot-blackened. A pair of trekking poles leaned against a tree, handles at the exact height someone had left them at while taking off a pack. No bodies, no voices, no note pinned to a trunk saying, "Gone to town," or "Emergency, left for road." Our route took us past a shelter later in the morning, one of the standard 3-sided jobs with bunks and a fire area. The logbook there had recent entries. People had signed in with dates from the previous day, little notes about the weather and the climb. No one had written anything about evacuations or problems. The last entry ended mid-sentence, as if someone had meant to come back to it. We lingered longer than we should have, waiting for someone to show up. The forest stayed stubbornly empty. That distant hum started up again at some point, low and constant, sitting under the sound of the wind, like a bass note under a melody. We never saw a single helicopter, plane, or vehicle. By then, a weight had settled on both of us. It wasn't just being alone. We'd both done stretches of trail without seeing anyone before. This felt different. This felt like walking through a place where people had been erased mid-move, their belongings left behind as proof they'd ever existed at all. We talked about turning around, about dropping back down toward the last road crossing, hitching out, pretending we'd just changed our minds about the section. But there was a pull forward, too, the same one that's always on trail, the maybe just to the next shelter drive, and practical reality. Our permits, our limited days. The logistics of backtracking kept us moving in the direction the prints pointed. We didn't see anyone all day. The second night, we camped at another designated site, this one with a clear view of the trail as it passed by. We set our tent close enough that anyone going past would be obvious. The hum was still there, the wind still moving, the trees still swaying. We ate quietly again, listening, waiting. "I don't like this place," my friend said finally. "Me either," I admitted. We agreed on a plan. If we heard footsteps again, we would unzip the tent immediately, step out, and actually stand on the trail, flashlights on. No more lying there, passive, listening. If there were people, we'd see them. If there weren't, then we'd have to live with whatever we saw instead. Sometime in the night, the hum cut out again. It was like someone pulled the plug on a giant machine. The sudden absence woke us both at once. We looked at each other in the dim glow from our watches, then looked at the ceiling of the tent, ears straining. The footsteps came back. Same soft, overlapping pattern, like a group moving together trying not to talk. They approached from the direction we'd come that day, rolling closer in a wave of small impacts. "Now," I whispered. We both lunged for the zipper. The sound of it tearing up the tent door felt deafening, wrong, like ripping fabric in a church. Cold air rushed in as we pushed the flap aside and scrambled out onto the ground, headlamps snapping on. The trail in front of us was empty. Our beams probed the path in both directions, slicing through the trees. The moss glowed green under the light. The dirt strip of the trail was darker, damp but undisturbed. No legs moving, no forms, no flash of reflective tape on a pack strap. The footsteps continued for another couple of heartbeats, overlapping our own quick breaths, then stopped, as if someone had pressed pause. The metallic smell hit again, stronger this time. It felt like sticking your head into a cold engine compartment. It coated the back of my throat, made me swallow hard. "Is this in my head?" my friend asked, voice tight. "I can smell it too," I said. And I heard them. We stood there for a long time, just two tiny cones of light in a huge, indifferent forest. The wind stayed absent. No branches moved. The hum did not return. It was just us and the feeling of being on a road that something else used now, without needing bodies to make the noise. We didn't sleep much after that. When dawn finally pushed a pale gray between the trees, we had already packed up most of our gear. The decision to bail wasn't a dramatic conversation. It just happened. Every shared look, every aborted sentence stacked up into one choice: leave. We took a side trail down toward a lower elevation, one that eventually curved toward a road and a chance at a ride out. As we descended, the forest changed. The spruces thinned, giving way to more mixed hardwoods. The moss was less dominant, the ground more straightforward dirt and leaves. The air thickened slightly, losing that razor-thin edge. Birds were louder. Somewhere a few miles below the ridge, we met our first person in nearly 2 days. A day hiker in a bright jacket coming up breathing hard, oblivious to anything but the climb. We stepped aside. "The way you do." They nodded, said a cheerful hello, and asked, "Busy up there today?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again. "Not really," I said finally. "Pretty quiet." We didn't tell them about the empty camps. We didn't mention the footsteps or the smell. We didn't warn them that there were more signs of people than people. I don't know if that was selfish or kind, maybe both. Back home, when people ask about that section, I talk about the views when the fog lifts, the strange beauty of the spruce fir forest, the way the clouds move through the trees like slow ghosts. I don't talk about how the hum at the edge of hearing cut out twice, or how the trail felt like it belonged to someone else for a while. I still hike, I still camp, but when I'm planning routes near places that are supposed to be crowded, I pay attention to how many voices I actually hear once I'm out there. Trails hold memory. Gear can be left. Fires can go out. Boot prints can point in a direction that doesn't lead to anyone. And if I ever wake up again to the sound of a whole group walking past my tent without a single headlamp or word, I don't think I'll unzip the door next time. Some things, once you're sure they're there, don't need to be seen to be real. Most people worry about what might be lurking in the dark woods around their camp. I learned the hard way. You should worry just as much about what's standing right above you when you're stupid enough to sleep in a dry creek bed. My name is Ian, and this happened a few miles outside Boone, North Carolina, off an old logging road I had no business trusting as much as I did. My cousin and I had gone out for a quick weekend trip. Nothing epic. Just a chance to get out of town, drink a couple of beers by a fire, and feel like we were still the kind of people who did real camping instead of just talking about it. The forecast said slim chance of rain. The sky looked fine. That turned out to be the most dangerous combination. Enough confidence to stop paying attention. We followed the logging road until it narrowed and broke apart. Weeds growing up the middle, ruts filling with leaves and old water. Off to the side, a dry creek bed cut through the woods, lined with rounded stones and the occasional bleached log. It was one of those gullies that told a clear story. At some point, a lot of water had come through there, often enough to carve a channel, but today it was nothing but dust and rocks. "Look at that," my cousin said. "Perfect flat spot." He wasn't wrong. Compared to the sloped, root-tangled forest floor on either side, the creek bottom looked like a natural tent pad. Wide enough for us to pitch without crowding, stones smoothed by years of flow, no saplings to clear. The banks rose up on both sides, steep, laced with roots like veins. Standing down there, the trees above us leaned in, branches forming a tunnel that blocked most of the sky. The smart part of my brain, the part that had sat through safety talks and read too many accident reports, whispered, "You don't sleep in drainage." The louder part looked at the flat ground, at the empty sky, at the dry stones cracked with tiny lines, and said, "Come on, it's fine. It hasn't seen water in forever." "Feels like a trench," I said anyway, trying to give that smaller voice a chance. "If anything comes down, it's all coming right here." He glanced up at the bank, shrugged. "Forecast clear. We're not that low. If it makes you feel better, we can keep our stuff packed tight. If it looks ugly later, we move." That sounded like a compromise. It wasn't really. It was me agreeing to do the lazy, comfortable thing while pretending we had a plan. We dropped packs, shuffled some bigger rocks aside to make enough level space for the tent, and set up right in the middle of the dry bed. Under my boots, the stones clicked and shifted. They were sun-bleached on top, but when you turned them over, they were darker, smoother, like you'd cracked a scab off and exposed fresh skin. The air down there felt cooler than up on the road. Not dramatic, just a couple of degrees, enough that when I climbed in and out I noticed the change. We gathered fallen branches from the flanks above, carrying them down into the trench. Building a fire in a channel like that was another mark against our judgment, I know, but at the time it felt efficient. Wind-blocked, heat-focused. Sparks drifted up and snagged on low branches, but nothing caught. The glow threw our shadows long and sharp against the banks, making the roots look like fingers reaching down toward us. As night came on, the forest beyond the creek bed dissolved into one big black wall. The canopy overhead was thick enough that only the brightest stars stabbed through, brief pinpricks when the smoke shifted. It felt like we were sitting at the bottom of a long, narrow hallway, open at the top but closed in all around. We drank. We told the same old stories. It felt good to laugh loud and not worry about neighbors. Every now and then, I'd climb the bank to pee or just stretch my legs on level ground. Up there, the air felt different somehow, more open, with a faint breeze. Down in the creek, it was still and heavier, like the air had settled and decided to stay. The first time I saw him, it didn't even register as a man so much as something wrong with the edge of my vision. I was sitting by the fire, turned slightly toward my cousin as he talked. At the corner of my eye, up on the bank behind him, a tall, dark shape stood just inside the tree line. Not a clear figure, not a face, just a vertical presence that matched nothing else around it. My head started to turn that way, automatically. Before my eyes could lock onto it, the shape wasn't there anymore. I was looking at a bare patch of bank, roots, a trunk leaning at a slight angle. Nothing that lined up with what I thought I'd seen. I told myself it was just the usual campfire trick, shadows sliding as the flames moved, your brain stitching them into form. I've stared at enough bonfires to know you can get whole crowds out of 3 tree trunks in a log. I turned back to the conversation and let it slide. It showed up again a little later, on the opposite side. This time, my cousin was mid-rant about something at work. I was mostly half listening, half watching the fire. Up on the other bank, just beyond the spill of light, something tall and long-limbed was there for a second. Not standing in a casual way, standing in that too-straight way people do when they're trying to be still and quiet. By the time I shifted my eyes toward it, it was gone again. "That's twice," I said without meaning to. "What?" my cousin asked. "Nothing," I lied. "Thought I saw, I don't know, a tree that looked like a person." "We are literally surrounded by those," he said, gesturing up at the trunks. He wasn't scared. That helped. I decided I wasn't either. As the night got deeper, the temperature dropped. Our breath started to fog faintly in the air. The stones underfoot held the cold, radiating it up through shoe soles. The fire sank to coals, and we let it, figuring the tent would be warmer anyway. We put the last cans away, double-checked the ridge of rocks we'd kicked around the pit, and crawled into the tent. Lying there, between 2 walls of earth, with only fabric above and around, the trench-like nature of the creek bed felt more intense. The soundscape changed, too. Up top, we'd heard a little wind in the branches, small nocturnal animal rustles. Down here, those sounds came muted and delayed, as if the banks were filtering them. I drifted for a while, Not quite asleep, not fully awake. Every time I felt myself starting to slip under, some tiny noise would tug me back. Stones settling, a branch creaking up high, a far-off car on the logging road we'd left behind. At some point, my cousin's voice came out of the dark. "You seeing that too?" he whispered. I blinked my eyes open. The tent fabric glowed faintly with whatever little light the night allowed. "Seeing what?" "Don't sit up yet," he said, voice low and tight. "Just look at the door. Out of the corner of your eye." I turned my head slightly. Through the thin mesh of the tent door, past the narrow strip where the creek bed climbed up to the bank, I could just make out the silhouette of trees against the darker sky. At the very top edge of my vision, to the left, a tall, narrow shadow stood among them. It was darker than the background, a cutout shape where branches should have been. My muscles tensed. I tried to look straight at it. My gaze tracked up, focused, and there was nothing there, just branches and a faint, uneven line of earth. "It vanishes when you look at it," my cousin said. "I've been watching it do that for, 10 minutes. My mouth went dry. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was hoping it was just me being jumpy," he said. "And because if you didn't see it, I didn't want to be the crazy one." We lay there, side by side, staring not at anything specific, but at the edges of our vision, where our eyes were worst at telling truth from trick. The figure came and went. Sometimes it seemed a little closer to us on the left bank. Sometimes, when we both happened to shift the same way, it flickered briefly on the right. "It's like when we both look one way, it moves to the other side," he said quietly. "Like it's trying to stay just off angle." "Stop talking," I said, because hearing him describe the exact thing my own brain was piecing together made it too real. He obeyed for once. The tent felt smaller, the air thicker. The stones under the ground sheet pressed at my back in a pattern I knew I'd remember later. A smell crept in then, so subtle at first I almost chalked it up to imagination. Dampness. The sharp, clean scent of wet stone that hasn't been wet in a while. Under it, something electric. Ozone, the way the air smells right before a big storm breaks. We hadn't felt a single drop of rain. The canopy overhead was dense enough that drizzle could have started without touching us yet. "You smell that?" my cousin whispered. "Yeah," I said. Lightning flickered somewhere beyond the trees, a stuttering glow that filtered down in tiny shards. The thunder came a few seconds later, low and distant, like a heavy object being rolled across a massive floor. The atmosphere in the creek shifted. The air felt heavier. The kind of weight that comes when humidity rises fast. The walls on either side of us, those banks we'd treated like harmless boundaries, suddenly read in my mind as funnels. "We should get out," I said. "Now?" he asked. "It's barely raining, and whatever that thing is." Another flash, closer this time. The following thunder rolled through the trench like it had been poured into it, the sound amplified between the banks. The faint scent of dust lifting off dry stone joined the dampness, like the creek bed itself was waking up. I unzipped the tent door. The sharp little rasp of plastic teeth sounded too loud. I half expected that dark figure to be right there, inches away, waiting. There was nothing obvious in front of us. The banks rose up, roots clutching the dirt, trees leaning in overhead like a crowd peering down into a pit. The stones around the tent gleamed slightly, the tiniest sheen of moisture catching what little light the sky offered. I climbed out on my knees, boots scraping rock, and immediately felt the difference under my hands. The stones weren't just cool anymore. They felt alive in a way. Heat bleeding out of the day, cold soaking in. My fingers came away with a film of fine grit and dampness. My cousin slid out behind me. The tent sagged a little as our weight left it. Another flash of lightning backlit the canopy, turning the branches into a black lace pattern against a white sky. For a half-second, on the left bank, at the edge of that stark contrast, something tall and wrong-angled stood among the trees. I didn't turn my head to look at it. Every instinct said if I did, it would disappear, and I was past wanting proof. I focused on the practical, on the immediate. "Grab the bags," I said. "Leave the rest if we have to, but get your pack on your back now." The first few fat drops of rain hit the stones around us, darkening them in spots. The sound they made was weirdly loud, given how small they were. Each impact rang slightly, like tapping on glass. We wrestled packs out of the tent and slung them on. The straps felt clumsy over my jacket. My fingers fumbled with buckles that I'd clipped 1,000 times before. I could feel my own hurry making me slower. The storm arrived in a rush. One moment it was a few hard drops, the next it was a sheet. Water hammered the canopy, then punched through it in streams, hitting the creek stones in a roar that instantly drowned out most other noise. The trench focused the sound, turning it into a tunnel of water and echo. "We have to go," I shouted, though my voice was a thin thread against the downpour. We scrambled toward the nearest bank. The slope that had been just a steep scramble on the way down was a slick mess now. Mud formed under my boots in seconds, turning roots into treacherous handholds. I dug my fingers in, grabbing for anything solid, feeling bark tear under my nails. Behind me, the stones in the creek shifted. Not a few here and there, many, all at once, grinding against each other under the first small surges of water. It started as a quick trickle, then grew. My ankles felt a cold lick as runoff found the old channel and remembered its path. We climbed like people trying to get out of a rising elevator shaft. Above us, lightning flashed again, thunder crashing almost on top of it. A sharp, cracking sound that rattled my teeth. The smell of ozone was strong enough to taste. Halfway up the bank, I made the mistake of looking back. The tent sat in the middle of the bed, already surrounded by a thin sheet of water that reflected the sky in broken pieces. The fabric sagged as the first wave lapped against it. Our little fire ring, rocks we'd placed so confidently, was disappearing under churning brown. For just an instant, on the opposite bank, exactly level with my line of sight, something stood. It was tall. Taller than any person I know. Its outline didn't match anything natural. Too straight in some places, too bent in others. It had the feeling of a person standing there, watching without any of the detail. No face, no clothes, just absence shaped like a body. My eyes jerked toward it. As soon as I tried to focus, it was gone. The space where it had been was full of rain and branches and nothing else. I turned back and kept climbing. We reached the top of the bank just as the real flood hit. What had been a thin stream a moment before became a wall. Water poured down the gully from upstream, picking up speed as it came. It slammed into the bend where we'd pitched our tent with a force that made the ground under my boots vibrate. The tent didn't stand a chance. 1 second it was there, the next it was a tangled piece of fabric being shoved downstream, bouncing off rocks like trash. The sound of the flood in that trench was like standing next to a freight train. It roared and bellowed, the noise bouncing off the banks and folding back on itself until it was all you could hear, feel, and think. The air cooled another few degrees as the volume of moving water sucked warmth out of everything. We stumbled back from the edge, away from the drop, feet slipping in the new mud. Rain lashed our faces. Trees thrashed in the wind that had finally caught up with the front. Every line of that dry creek bed we'd admired earlier was now hidden under churning, angry brown. Above us, the forest suddenly felt like the safest place in the world. We stood there, panting, soaked, staring down at what could easily have been our grave. Neither of us had the breath to speak for a minute. When we finally did, it came out ragged. "If we'd stayed 5 more minutes," my cousin said. "Yeah," I answered. "I know." The rational part of me wanted to write it off as luck. Bad decision plus good timing equals narrow escape. But in the back of my mind, another thought had already been planted and was starting to grow roots. It hadn't just been luck that we'd been so worked up we bolted before the real surge. Something had been making it impossible to relax down there. Something had been needling our nerves, showing up only when we weren't looking, keeping us uneasy enough to move. We found higher ground a little ways away and set up a makeshift shelter under some trees, more for psychological cover than real dryness. Neither of us wanted to go back toward the logging road in the dark. The thunder rolled off into the distance eventually, leaving just rain and wind and the aftersound of our own heartbeat in our ears. When the storm finally passed and morning crept in gray and weak, we went back to look. The creek bed was transformed. Stones had shifted and piled, some new, larger ones dragged in from upstream. Debris tangled in branches, sticks, leaves, clumps of grass, a scrap of bright tent fabric that had to be ours. The channel was still trickling with leftover water, but the main violence had moved on. Where our tent had been, the ground looked scoured. Mud plastered the sides of rocks, showing how high the surge had gotten. We picked our way down carefully, boots slipping. That was when my cousin stopped and grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Look," he said. In a patch of softer, sandy silt that hadn't been there the night before, near where the center of our tent would have been, a set of footprints had been pressed into the ground. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were deeper than anything our shoes had left, even when we'd been stomping around earlier. The toes were long, the arch was high. Whatever had made them had weight to it, but not the weight of heavy gear, weirdly focused, like the pressure had been applied carefully. There were only a few, 3 or 4, in a staggered line, as if something had stood there for a moment, shifted its stance, then stepped away. The direction they pointed was upstream, into a part of the gully where the rocks were piled too thick for clear impressions. "We didn't," my cousin started. "We had boots on the whole time," I said, "and we were never barefoot here, even for a second. It was all stone before the flood." We stared at the prints, the edges already starting to soften as residual water seeped through the silt. "You think," he began, then stopped, like saying it out loud would make it too real. I didn't answer. I didn't want to give the thought words either. We moved back up to the logging road in silence. The drainage line we'd followed in looked different now, more obviously a path for water than a path for people. The idea that we'd walked down it so casually the day before made my stomach twist. On the drive back to town, we tried on explanations like different jackets. Bad luck. Our brains playing games, some local we hadn't noticed. We turned the figure in the corner of our vision into a campfire story, then into a joke, then back into something we didn't want to talk about. Later, I looked up flood warnings and all the official advice about camping near creek beds. They all say the same thing. Don't do it. Weather changes fast. Water can rise without local rain. What happened to us fits neatly into those warnings. Textbook example of what not to do. What doesn't fit cleanly is the feeling of being watched only when we weren't watching back. The way that dark shape seemed determined to stay just outside our direct gaze. The way our unease pivoted from general, "this feels trench-like," to sharp, specific nerves that pushed us to climb out exactly when we did. If it was trying to scare us into moving, it worked. Now, whenever I see a dry creek bed, I keep walking. Flat ground is not worth betting your life on, and when the hairs on the back of my neck stand up because something at the edge of my vision feels off, I don't argue with it. Whether it's just my brain or something else using the corner of my eye as a hiding place, I've learned to take the hint and get out of the channel before the water, or whatever's riding with it, decides to come through. Some warnings are painted to be ignored, until the woods make it clear they're not for laughing off. That's exactly how we learned rules really do have consequences in a place nobody else was likely to hear you scream. My name is Melvin. I've camped all over Virginia's backwoods, but I'll never forget the time we tried to act clever against warnings that were older than most of us. It was early fall, the kind of weekend that's already cool at night and crisp enough to make smoke from the fire hug close in the trees. There were 4 of us, real friends, the kind who tease more than talk. We wanted something away from crowds, a real find your own spot and build your own fire kind of camp. So we followed an overgrown fire road deep into George Washington National Forest. The fire road had become more moss than gravel. The brush pressed in like it was reclaiming the path. Every so often, an old hunting blind rotted half-collapsed near the edge. At a curve where the trees thickened and all sign of tire tracks vanished, the road ended in a flat pull-off. We parked and hiked a bit farther, pushing through thick undergrowth and weaving past huge ferns. Eventually, we found a half-cleared spot under oaks and maples, the perfect unofficial site. Old fire ring, logs pulled up for seats, and a big fallen tree as a windbreak. Looking for kindling, my friend shouted, "You guys see this?" A chunk of plywood, weathered but still solid, was nailed to a squat pine at the edge of the clearing. The writing was a mix of faded black marker and new scratches. There were rules. No whistling after dark. Do not leave food in the creek. Do not say your full name out loud. Don't stack stones near the fire. No fires past midnight. If you hear singing, don't answer it. Beneath that someone had scrawled in much shakier script, "You were warned." We laughed. My friend filmed it and did a dramatic creepypasta voice, then made up nonsense rules. The youngest, always cocky, read them out like he was the MC at a haunted house. We thought maybe teenagers made them. Everyone in this part of Virginia has a family story about wood spirits or strange music at night. It was as good as an urban legend, right? We broke every rule before dinner was cold. We whistled to call another friend back to camp. Two of us tossed food wrappers behind a log, not into the creek, but one guy eventually rinsed his coffee cup in the stream. Someone started stacking river stones into a little tower beside the fire. We all said our own names out loud at least once, laughing about how formal it sounded to introduce yourself in the woods. Around sunset, an animal call broke the rhythm of the woods, a high screech from far up the hill. The chipmunks stopped chattering. The birds cut out almost instantly, so the only sound left was the fading crackle of the campfire. A brisk wind died to stillness. It was only then I noticed how weirdly tight the clearing felt. Our camping stories meant to carry an echo seemed muffled. The fire's light didn't stretch far. Instead of big, open darkness, it created a ring where everything outside was black as ink. The sound of the creek got quieter, too, almost like the water itself was holding its breath. The first odd thing we noticed was our food. After cleaning up, we'd hung our bags on a line between two trees. Not high enough to be bear-safe, but enough to keep raccoons honest. In the morning, we found the bags neatly set on the ground 10 feet from where we'd left them. They weren't torn or chewed open, just rearranged. Some of the contents, like granola bars and noodles, were halfway pulled out, lined up as if for inspection. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. The stranger part. They were each placed near the creek we'd been told not to use. The youngest guy joked it must be a very considerate thief. We tried to make light of it, but that humor faded when our friend found his water bottle at the base of the rule tree, cap unscrewed, bone dry inside, even though he swore he'd left it full. Later, after breakfast, one of us quietly admitted he'd woken to what sounded like someone whistling from the line of trees. 3 notes, not a song, but enough to match the no whistling after dark rule. He didn't mention it because he thought it was someone dreaming or hearing another camper farther off. "I figured it was just a bird," he said. But before he finished his sentence, the woods hushed again. You hear these forest quiets described sometimes, how everything stops at once, like a switch is thrown. It's always more powerful in real life. Animals go silent. The breeze stills. Even the sound of your own coat swishing seems rude and loud. While we debated the rules, a faint sound emerged from up the slope, singing. Wordless, but rhythmic. Just notes rising and falling like a group humming a lullaby. Not close, not far, but definitely made by voices trying to keep in time. Every single person froze. It's hard to describe the feeling, except it made me want to shrink myself into the smallest version possible. Goosebumps prickled across my arms and my jaw locked tight. One friend, whose bravado had started the night before, muttered, "It's just someone joking with us." I wanted to believe him, but nobody made a sound from our group, not even a nervous laugh. The singing continued, wavering, tuneless, moving grid-like across the woods but never getting closer. Eventually, mercifully, it faded, and the forest snapped back to itself. A few brave crickets started up. The breeze returned, and our fire seemed cheerier. It was only later, around the dying coals, when we were winding toward sleep, that the real breaking of the rules became personal. The youngest, already half asleep near the furthest tent, started talking in his sleep. At first it was mumbles. Then, clear as if he were awake, he said his own full name, first, middle, last, in a sharp, formal tone. As soon as he finished, the wind outside our tents picked up from nothing to a sharp gust, rattling the fly with a sudden whip-like snap. Nobody else stirred except me. I heard the words, thought, "That's weird," and drifted in and out of anxious sleep, every little sound amplified in the still camp. The next morning, as we stepped in the gray, misty half-light to start coffee, our youngest friend crawled out looking pale. He said he'd had nightmares of faces in the trees, blank, too wide, eyes leaking black, and a feeling that he was being watched from the rule tree itself. He lifted the hem of his shirt, and there, on his back, were 3 thin, bloody scratches, shallow but running perfectly parallel. I helped him check the tent. On the wall, inside near his head, someone or something had traced his initials into the condensation, right where his breath would have fogged the fabric overnight. Nobody felt like laughing at the sign that morning. The air had a weight to it. Animal sounds didn't resume until long after sunrise, and even then they sounded muffled and distant. The creek was lower than before, but clear signs that something had walked in the mud led from the fire ring to the bank and back, despite nobody from our group leaving camp after dark. Before we left, we checked the plywood sign. During the night, someone, or something, had added a new line beneath the original warning, this one written with what looked like a fresh, still sticky black something instead of marker. "You are warned. Don't come back." We didn't take the sign, didn't film a follow-up, didn't joke about what it would take to really scare us anymore. The drive out was silent, except for a few nervous glances in the mirror. The moss on the fire road seemed to have grown overnight. And as we pulled back onto the paved highway and rejoined the world, a bird whistled 3 notes from the trees beside us, sharp, clear, and terribly out of sync with all the local songs. Since then, I've never ignored a sign that looked handmade, especially one deep in the woods. I don't hunt for local legends. I keep my food out of creeks. I never whistle after dark. And if a rule doesn't make sense, I assume I simply don't understand who or what enforced it before I arrived. Clifftop campsites are supposed to feel exposed, but not like the rock itself is watching to see if you notice you're not alone anymore. Up in Red River Gorge, I found out what that feels like the night my camp quietly copied itself. My name is Azaria, and climbing has been the one constant in a life that hasn't had many. The first time I went to the Red, I remember feeling like I'd stepped onto another planet. Towering sandstone walls, pockets and crimps everywhere, natural arches framing slices of sky. On this particular trip, it was just me and a partner, a long weekend of roots and bad gas station coffee. We weren't doing anything extreme, just pushing ourselves a little and sleeping cheap wherever we could throw a tent. That day, we hiked out along one of the ridgetop trails that thread above the gorge. It was late season. Most of the big summer crowds gone, and the air had that cool weight that warns you, night is going to be colder than you think. We picked a spot just off the trail, on a flat slab of rock a few meters back from a sheer drop. Technically, you're supposed to be a certain distance from cliffs, but we weren't right at the edge. We could stand up, walk forward 3 steps, and still be safe. You hear signs of people all day in the Red. Laughter echoing from crags, quick bursts of nice from belay partners, the metallic clink of gear. That afternoon, though, we hadn't seen anybody as we moved along the ridge to our chosen spot. No voices, no headlamps bobbing ahead, no tents tucked among the pines. It felt like we'd lucked into a private balcony over the whole valley. We pitched our small tent on the flattest part of the slab, staking out where we could and anchoring guy lines to rocks where we couldn't. Red dust worked its way into everything almost immediately. On our hands, our packs, the tent floor. When I crawled inside to spread out the pads, the fabric already carried the gritty feel you only get in sandstone areas, like the ground is trying to come with you. Right beyond camp, the land dropped away, suddenly. During daylight, you could see an entire world from there, the valley spreading out, ridges layered behind one another in blues and greens, natural arches carved out of cliff faces like windows. As the sun sank, all of that blurred into deeper and deeper shades, until only the outline of the nearest arch was visible, a darker cutout against the darkening sky. Even after the sky went fully black, there were little reminders people existed somewhere out there. A faint smell of wood smoke drifted up from far below, probably from legal campsites near the river. Every once in a while, a distant shout or laugh would float up, warped by the stone until it sounded hollow and far away. Our own gear chimed occasionally when the breeze moved it, rope coils shifting, carabiners nudging each other with tiny metallic taps. We cooked on a small stove, ate sitting at the tent door with our legs hanging over the side of the rock like kids on a dock, and then put everything away carefully. This wasn't a place you wanted loose items lying around. A rolled ankle on that slab could easily turn into a fall if you stumbled in the wrong direction. We double-checked the edge with our headlamps, saw nothing but rock, scrub trees, and open air, then crawled inside. Sleep came fast. A full day on vertical terrain does that. My last clear memory before dropping off was the sound of the wind rising up from the valley in slow breaths. It wasn't a gusting wind, more like a constant exhale, persistent and low. Sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of a zipper. Not ours. It was close, the specific rasp of tent teeth being parted, and then meshed again. It happened once, then again. Zip, pause, zip. After the third time, with my brain finally climbing out of sleep fog, I realized there was a softer layer underneath. Low voices. They weren't speaking English. It didn't sound like Spanish either, or any language I could pick out from movies or music. It was murmur and cadence, syllables that rose and fell in a way that clearly meant something to whoever was speaking, but slid right off my understanding. One voice was a little higher, one lower, but they both stayed in that hush people use when they're trying not to bother neighbors. For a few seconds, I lay there in that half-awake state, trying to decide if I was dreaming. Then my partner shifted beside me and whispered, "You hearing that?" "Yeah," I whispered back. The tent was dark except for a faint glow near the top from the sky beyond. Our own zipper was closed. The sound outside came again. Zipper. Soft voices. A quiet knock of something metallic on rock. I could have sworn we were alone up here. "Maybe someone came in late," my partner whispered. "Another pair, like us. They must have set up after dark." I thought about that. It wasn't impossible, but we hadn't heard any footsteps. No crunch of gravel. No scuff of shoes on stone. No swearing at a stubborn tent pole. Just sleep, then zipper. "Light?" I asked. "Yeah, you or me." "I'll do it," I said, because my heart was already racing too fast to go back to sleep without knowing. I reached up slowly, trying not to make our sleeping bags roar with noise. My hand found the headlamp where I'd left it near the door, the elastic band cool under my fingers. I slipped it on, felt for the zipper, and in one quick motion, ripped it halfway open and shoved my head out, thumb pressing the light on. The beam caught rock, rope, and another tent. It sat just a few meters away, pitched on the same slab near the cliff edge, at an angle that mirrored ours, almost exactly. Same size, same shape, same brand and model. I recognized the logo patch and the exact arrangement of guy lines. Its fabric was even the same color, that muted shade that shows dust and dirt in the same pattern as ours. The door of the second tent was half unzipped, flap hanging slightly open. No light inside, no silhouettes moving. The rope pile beside it, coiled neatly, looked just like ours. A couple of carabiners lay nearby. For a second, my brain simply refused to process it as anything more than, "Those are our things," twice. The voices had stopped when I'd opened our tent. The breeze kept moving, bringing with it a faint trace of smoke, but nothing else. I swept the light around, checking for people crouched or standing just out of the beam. Nothing. Just the lip of the cliff, the brush beyond, and the darkness dropping away into the valley. My partner squinted past me. "When did they get here?" they whispered. "I don't know," I said. "We would have heard them. There's not enough space to sneak a whole camp in without noise." We watched for a while, breathing shallow, as if the sound inside our tent might travel outward and disturb whatever lay beyond. The second tent sat there, unbothered by our light, door slightly open, motionless. "Could we have just not noticed?" my partner asked, sounding unconvinced even as they said it. "On bare rock, 10 feet away," I said. "No." We whispered theories back and forth in that panicked, forced casual way people do when they're trying not to admit they're scared. Maybe we'd missed a party arriving while we were snoring. Maybe someone set up while we both rolled over. Maybe we were sleepwalking. Each explanation fell apart when held up against simple facts. "Call out," my partner suggested. "Hey," I said louder, aiming my voice at the other tent. "Sorry if we woke you. Just checking. You guys all right?" My words bounced off the cliff and came back thin and distorted from somewhere down in the gorge. The other tent didn't move. No answering voice, no zipper shift, no rustle of fabric. I felt the wind lift my hair slightly, bringing that faint wood smoke smell stronger for a second, then letting it slide away. "Nobody's in there," I said quietly. "How do you know?" they asked. "Because if they were, they'd be reacting," I said. "Even if they were freaked out, we'd hear something. That's too quiet." We backed into our own tent, sliding the zipper down again, just to put a barrier between us and whatever was out there. It wasn't about safety, not really. A second tent appearing on bare rock already broke our sense of what counted as normal danger. But having the fabric between us and the emptiness helped us feel like we were inside a defined space again. The rest of the night blurred into pulses of sleep and sharp awareness. Every time I drifted off, some small noise would jerk me back. The creak of a tree, a new clink of metal. Once, I woke certain I'd heard that foreign murmur again, words in a language I couldn't parse, coming from the direction of the identical tent. My partner woke at different times, turning over and staring at the ceiling with pupils wide and black. Neither of us unzipped the door again. At some point, dawn started pressing white at the edges of the tent fabric. My head throbbed with that dehydrated, half-rested pain you get after bad sleep. A bird called once, then again, its song bouncing faintly off the rock walls across the valley. I couldn't put it off. I reached for the zipper, told my partner, "I'm going to look," and pulled the door open. The second tent was gone. The flat slab of rock where it had stood was empty, except for a coil of rope lying in the exact spot I remembered seeing their rope the first time. The rock dust and red soil around it were disturbed, but not in any clear footprint pattern, more like something heavy had been placed and moved. The rope was identical to ours. Same brand, same color, same diameter. It was coiled neatly, but one end was frayed in a way ours wasn't. Threads puffed out and darkened like somebody had run it over rough stone under load. The very tip was stained with something that had dried brown-black. "Tell me that's ours," my partner said behind me, voice low. "It's not," I said. "Ours is right here." I pointed to our own coil, tucked halfway under the vestibule where we'd left it, still looped the way I'd done it, with a little kink where I'd gotten distracted mid-wrap. 2 identical ropes, one familiar, one not. The hollow valley air carried a faint echo of voices then, far away. Regular morning sounds of other camps down in the gorge. People waking up, maybe, laughing about burnt oatmeal or cold coffee. Normal life. Up on our cliff, it all felt like a different world. We stepped out slowly, checking for any sign of a second camp. There were no extra stake holes in the ground, no annealed impressions in the dust where another tent might have been. Just our own flattened patch, the rope, and a couple of empty spots where stone looked a little cleaner than I remembered. "We're leaving," my partner said, and I didn't argue. We packed quickly, more carefully than we would have on any regular morning. Every carabiner, every quick draw, every piece of gear got checked, counted, and stowed. The identical rope we considered for a second, then left where it lay. Neither of us wanted to touch it more than we had to. As we hiked back down toward the trailhead, we kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see that other tent standing somewhere else, just off the path, slotted neatly into a space we could have sworn had been empty moments before. The wind shifted and brought the smell of wood smoke from a different angle. Rock dust worked its way deeper into the seams of our clothes. Back in the parking area, other climbers were gearing up, groups laughing, slinging ropes over their shoulders. The normalcy was jarring. A couple of people asked, "You guys camp up on the ridge?" "Good night?" "Yeah," I said automatically. "Good view." We didn't mention anything about duplicate tents or phantom camps. Try saying, "We're fine, but last night our camp got copied, and we woke up to someone else's rope where their tent used to be," without sounding like you're fishing for attention. We just nodded, smiled, and got in the car. It was only later, cleaning gear at home, that something small made my stomach drop. Our rope had a faint spot on the sheath, about a third of the way down. A scuff I didn't remember seeing before. When I ran my fingers over it, the texture felt rougher there, like the fibers had been pushed around. It was just enough different from the rest of the line that I knew I'd always see it now. I cut that section out. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was smart. Either way. Watching that piece fall away into the trash felt like cutting off a story I didn't want hanging over my head every time I tied in. Since then, I've been a lot more aware of how thin the line is between alone and almost alone. It's one thing to worry about animals, strangers, storms. It's another to realize that in some places the landscape itself seems to keep a template of you, your tent, your rope, your routine. And sometimes during the night it tries out a copy of that template just to see how you react. If I wake up now to unfamiliar zippers and voices outside a tent in a spot I'm sure was empty at dusk, I don't wait around to see if the neighbors say good morning. Some mysteries you can climb around forever and never find the top of. Some sounds make you feel like you're not alone. The laughter on Panther Knob made it feel like the mountain itself was pretending to be human and doing a bad job. My name is Monica, and most of the time when I'm out in the woods, the only thing I'm afraid of is doing something stupid with a rifle or a ridgeline. I grew up around hunters, uncles, neighbors, men who knew every hollow and knob in our part of West Virginia by first name. Panther Knob was one of those places people talked about like it belonged to them, even if all they really owned was a couple of stories and some rusted beer cans. The hidden camp up there wasn't on any map. You got to it by taking an old logging track off the main road, then cutting uphill along a faint path only visible if you already knew where to look. I'd heard about it at the counter of a feed store, in that low, sideways way older guys have when they're testing if you're from around here enough to understand. "Good little spot up on Panther," one of them had said. "Old stand, flat place for a fire, locals camp, just you and the deer." So when I finally had a free weekend at the right time of year, I headed up alone. The afternoon was clear and cold, the kind that makes every sound sharp. Leaves crunched under my boots as I climbed. The trees thinned as the ridge narrowed, letting patches of pale sky show through thin pine branches. Somewhere below, water moved in a rocky draw, a soft, steady rush that never quite got louder or softer. The camp was exactly where they said it would be. A rough little flat spot tucked just below the crest, screened from the road by scrub and young pines. An old wooden deer stand leaned against a big tree at the edge, its ladder missing 2 rungs and the platform above tilted at a weary angle. Rusted cans and broken glass glinted in the weak light around the fire ring. Decades of whoever came before me, drinking more than they packed out. It felt like stepping into a used living room. Someone else's mess, somebody else's history. I set my small tent back from the fire circle, on a patch of needle-soft ground. The air had that particular smell you only get on a cold, dry evening. Wood smoke ghosts from old fires, pine pitch, a little tang of metal from the stand's nails, and bolts rusting slowly away. Every so often, the old deer stand creaked with a sound like a heavy person shifting their weight, even when there was no wind strong enough to move it. I got a fire going as the light drained out of the sky, flames licking at deadfall I'd gathered from the slope below. The stars came out one by one through the lattice of branches, clear and cold. The firelight reflected off the ridged sides of the old cans and the jagged faces of glass shards, throwing tiny points of brightness back at me from the ground. Up there, away from traffic and houses and whatever passes for civilization, sound travels weird. A far-off dog bark can sound like it's behind the next tree. A truck on a highway miles away shows up as a low, occasional growl. That night, for a long while, it was just the normal noises. Crackling wood, my own movements, the small size of a forest settling into full dark. I ate, cleaned up, and sat with my boots near the fire until my toes stopped aching from the chill. Eventually, I leaned back against a log, eyes half closed, letting the rhythm of the flames pull my thoughts into that loose drift before sleep. The first burst of laughter felt like somebody had dropped a bar fight into the woods. It came from just beyond the circle of firelight, off to my right, loud enough that I flinched. Harsh, drunken laughter, too big for the space, more sound than the bodies behind it could justify. It rolled in overlapping waves, as if 3 or 4 throats were letting loose at once. No real humor in it, just noise. I sat bolt upright, my heart thudding. A second later, the sharp clink of glass on glass followed, bottles hitting together in that casual, careless way people have when they've been drinking long enough to stop paying attention. "Okay," I said out loud, more to keep my own brain from spiraling than for anyone else's benefit. Guess I'm not alone. A thin, tinny strand of music drifted in behind the laughter, almost lost under it. It sounded like an old country song half-tuned on a bad radio. Steel guitar warped, vocals in and out, the melody never quite resolving into something I recognized. It wobbled in pitch like the signal was coming and going, but it never got closer or farther away. I grabbed my headlamp and rifle more out of habit than expectation of trouble and called out, "Hey there, didn't see any trucks down the road. You folks hunting up here too?" The laughter didn't pause, didn't lower, didn't shift into the slightly more polite mode people use when they realize they've got neighbors. It just kept going, same volume, same angles, like the sound was on a loop. If anything, it grated more the longer it went on, something forced about it, like whoever was making it had forgotten what laughing with other humans is supposed to feel like, and was just hitting the notes. The music skated along underneath, a warble and twang that kept almost but not quite getting to a chorus. I stood up, headlamp off for the moment so I wouldn't blind myself in the fire glare, and moved to the edge of the light. The ground dropped away in a steep tangle of laurel and rock a few yards from my tent, the ridge curving around so that if there were other camps nearby, they'd get the same wind and same view. "Hello?" I called again. "Radio sounds good. You got room for one more around the fire?" I waited for the usual script. Someone calling back, laughing softer, saying they'd wondered who else was crazy enough to be out here tonight. Nothing. The laughter rolled on just the same, but it didn't feel like it was directed at or away from me. It just existed, hanging in the trees. The deer stand creaked then, a long, complaining noise, like weight had shifted up there. I turned my head in that direction, suddenly sure I'd see someone sitting in the sagging platform, legs dangling, beer in hand, radio propped beside them. The stand was empty, just old wood and rusted nails, dark against the darker sky. I clicked my headlamp on, the beam cutting a tunnel through the night. I swept it slowly across the trees, rocks, and tangle beyond the fire. The laughter didn't falter as the light passed over each branch and trunk. It didn't get louder when the beam pointed one way or another. The music kept warbling, never syncing up with what I was hearing or seeing. Then, without warning, everything stopped. Not faded, not trailed off, stopped. 1 second it was loud, messy, grating laughter and off-key radio. The next, it was silence so complete I thought for a second I'd gone deaf. Even the fire seemed to hush, the pops and crackles suddenly too small to count as real sound. The last thing left, hanging there, just for an instant, was a single note from the radio. A high, thin sound that held far too long, like a singer stuck on a breath they couldn't run out. It hung there for several seconds, impossible and steady, then cut off in mid-tone. No static, no end of a word, just a hard stop. The woods didn't rush to fill the gap. It stayed quiet enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, heavy and out of place. The deer stand gave one soft creak, like an exhale, and then that too was done. Every hair on my arm stood up. "Okay," I said softly to the empty dark. "That's enough." I backed toward my fire, forcing myself not to flick the light into every shadow now that sound had refused to behave like it should. The air felt colder, like whatever heat the flames had been putting out got sucked straight up into the night. A rational part of me tried to assemble explanations. Sound carries weird. Maybe there was a party down in the next hollow, and my ears were folding the noise upward. Maybe some hunters had come in from another approach and were camped just past a fold in the ridge. Maybe the song was from an actual old radio, the kind that warbles when you move. None of those theories explained the perfect instant mute. I added wood to the fire, more for comfort than warmth, and stayed outside longer than I should have. Not ready to zip myself into a thin nylon bag and pretend the only world that mattered was inside it. I listened hard. The normal sounds came back in tiny pieces. A single cricket testing the air, a small animal rustling in leaves, a distant owl. The laughter didn't return. Neither did the music. When I finally forced myself into the tent, the silence came with me. The stars outside shone through gaps in the branches, cold and indifferent. The deer stand gave another small creak at some point, just once, then fell still. Sleep was stitched out of thin strips that night. Every time I felt myself sinking, some imagined sound pulled me back. An echo of a bottle clink, a phantom note from that frozen song. Once, I woke certain I'd heard a chair scuff on rock just outside the tent. The kind of sound you get when someone pushes back from a fire at the end of a long night. When I lay there, holding my breath though, there was nothing but my own heartbeat and the faint whisper of wind. Eventually, exhaustion overruled everything, and I slipped under properly. Morning on Panther Knob was brutally bright. The sky had gone hard, clear blue. Frost silvered the leaves and the old cans around the fire ring, sharp and clean. My breath puffed white in the air as soon as I sat up. The fire was a dead pile of ash and half-charred wood. No sign of it having burned longer than I'd seen. I stepped out of the tent and looked around with the awful certainty of someone checking the scene of a crime. No new tracks cut across the ground around camp. The soil and leaf litter showed my own boot prints. The scuffs from where I'd carried wood, and nothing else. Down the slope where I'd thought the sound had come from, the ground was undisturbed. No flattened grass, no cigarette butts, no fresh trash. Just old beer cans half buried in dirt, labels gone, and brown glass shards pressed into the soil like strange fossils. The deer stand looked exactly as before, leaning, empty, one rung missing. A squirrel scolded me from a nearby tree, regular and annoyed, as if to say, "You're late. This is my time now." I walked a slow circle, wider and wider, scanning for any evidence of another overnight camp. In a little hollow just beyond the main site, where the land dipped and then rose, I saw something soft and pale on the ground, at the edge of where the firelight would have reached. It was a hat. Not new, not ancient. Sun faded to a color that might once have been dark, brim sweat-stained, brim edge frayed. It lay crowned down, like someone had set it there on purpose beside where a chair might have been, then forgotten it. When I picked it up, dirt fell away from the band in dry crumbs. No logo I recognized, no bright patch, just a generic old ball cap with age baked into every thread. There weren't any footprints leading to or from that spot either. I stood there, hat in hand, and thought about the way the laughter had filled the trees. Loud, sloppy, almost joyful on the surface, until you listened to the edges and realized there was nothing in it but repetition. Like a recording of happy noise, played back in a place that had forgotten what joy sounded like firsthand. I could have taken the hat. Maybe 25-year-old me would have, as a souvenir. A physical proof to hold up while telling the story later. Instead, I set it gently back down where I'd found it. Brim pointing toward the fire ring, a small marker that I'd been there and chosen not to disturb what wasn't mine. On the walk out, the woods sounded normal. Leaves rustled, birds called. A jet far above scratched a line of sound across the sky. Down near the road, I even heard real human laughter, thin and distant from a couple setting up in a legal campground nearby. It sounded different, fuller, shaped by actual conversation instead of existing on its own, a sound with a reason behind it. Every once in a while, though, some rhythm in the noise of the world would click together just wrong, and my shoulders would tense. A bottle clink, a too-long note in a song on someone's radio. The kind of silence that falls between tracks on an old playlist. Each time, I half expected the woods themselves to hit play on that other laughter again, the one with no warmth inside it. I still hunt. I still camp. Panther Knob hasn't seen the last of me. But when I set up in places that feel locals only now, I pay more attention to the leftover trash, the leaning stands, the ghosts of old campfires. And if night comes and the sound of a party drifts in from just beyond the edge of my light, I don't assume there's anywhere for those people to actually be. Crowded family campgrounds are supposed to feel safe, like chaos with training wheels. The night my son showed up in 2 different places at once, it felt like the woods were trying on his face to see if it fit. My name is Kenna, and this was supposed to be the easiest kind of trip you can take with a kid. One night at a family campground near an Appalachian Trail access point in North Georgia. Not a backcountry sufferfest, not a test your limits thing, just a ring of RVs, glow of lanterns, kids on bikes, and the distant hum of the highway reminding you that real life is never that far away. We pulled in late afternoon, the sun still up but leaning toward the tops of the trees. The campground was a patchwork of setups, big RVs with satellite dishes, pop-up campers, a few plain tents like ours scattered among them. Strings of fairy lights and awning LEDs gave some sites a holiday feel. Smoke drifted up from grills and fire pits, smelling like propane, burgers, and wood all layered together. My son pressed his face to the window as we drove the loop. "There are other kids," he said, that particular excitement in his voice that only comes from seeing a potential friends. Small bikes lay on their sides near gravel roads. A group of kids were playing some made-up game near the trees, weaving between trunks at the edge of the campground, where the safe circle of light faded into the wall of woods. Our site was near the back, where the RVs thinned out and the tent pads took over. We could see the trailhead sign down a little slope, simple wooden post, white blaze marking the way to the AT up the ridge. The highway's hum was a thin line in the background, just enough to remind you it was there without drowning out the birds. We set up the tent between a lantern post and a picnic table, my son helping by feeding me steaks and asking every 3 minutes if he could go ride his bike. He'd been buzzing all day about camping for real near the trail he'd seen on maps and in photos. This was the compromise. Close enough to see it. Far enough that I could still plug in a phone and buy ice if something went sideways. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, the campground lights took over. RVs glowed from inside, blue from TVs and warm from overhead fixtures. Lanterns hung from branches and posts, casting yellow pools. Our little fire crackled at the edge of our sight, light bouncing off the metal ring and the shiny sides of neighboring campers. Kids' laughter rose and fell, mixed with the hiss of Coleman stoves and the occasional bark of a bored dog. After we ate, my son asked if he could go play near the trees where the other kids had gathered earlier. I could see the cluster, a loose group near the tree line between our loop and the darkness beyond. Bikes lay scattered. One of the older kids had a glow stick he was whipping in circles, leaving neon trails. "Stay where I can see you," I said. "Don't go past the first trees. And if I call, you answer." "Okay," he said, already half turned away. He jogged off, that uneven, eager kid gait, sneakers scuffing on gravel. I watched him join the group by the trees, standing a little awkwardly at first, while the others debated something, then gradually getting pulled into whatever game they were inventing. I could hear snatches of high-pitched voices, the rattle of a bike being dragged, someone's parent calling a name from a few sites over. It felt normal, safe, the kind of scene that ends up in someone's photo album labeled First Campout. I took a breath, sat back on the bench, and let myself enjoy the simple fact that my kid was out there being a kid while I sat by a fire with a mug in my hands. Around me, RV doors thunked. A grill lid clanged shut. The highway hummed. The line between campground and forest stayed sharp. Light, noise, and people on one side, black shapes and crickets on the other. Maybe 15-20 minutes passed. I lost track, poking at the fire, scrolling through my phone for a second, answering a text from someone who'd asked how the trip was going. At some point, the kids' game shifted farther along the tree line, and I couldn't pick out my son's voice anymore in the general chaos. It didn't worry me at first. Sound drifts weird in places like that. I could still see the arc of that glow, stick sometimes, like a slow neon comet passing behind trunks. When I looked up again, the group of kids had thinned. Some had been called back to campsites. A couple of bikes lay abandoned near the bathhouse path. The glow stick had vanished. The only clear motion near the trees was a small figure standing alone at the edge of the woods, just where the last of the lantern light bled into darkness. He was facing me, very still, feet just inside the tree line. The background behind him was black, the trunks on either side making a kind of frame. Light from the campground spilled across the front of him in a soft wash, enough to see shape and color. My brain slotted the image into place. My son. Same hoodie, same jeans, same sneakers, same small hands hanging at his sides. But his face. At that distance, you shouldn't be able to read much expression unless someone is really animated. Even so, something was wrong about the way he was holding it. Too flat, too neutral. His eyes, which should have been catching and reflecting the scattered light, looked like dark buttons from where I sat. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He just stared. A cold twist turned in my stomach. "Hey, buddy," I called, lifting a hand. "You okay?" He didn't answer. There was the slightest delay, like my voice reached him and had to travel through something else before it got there. Then he took a step forward. It was the right size step for his legs, but the timing was off. There was a hitch, a tiny lag between the intention and the movement, like someone watching a video of a child walking and trying to match it a beat behind. His arm swung, but a fraction too late. His foot landed on gravel, and even from here I felt like I should have heard it, but the sound didn't quite line up with what I saw. "Hey," I said again, standing now. "Come on in. Time to stay close." He walked toward our site. 3 steps. 4. Each one just barely wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. If you'd filmed it and played it back, it might have looked fine. But live, in that strange half-light, My instincts were screaming that I was watching something imitate a child, not actually be one. The background sounds of the campground blurred. The laughter from the next loop sounded muffled, as if filtered. The faint music from someone's Bluetooth speaker down the row warped for a second, like a record being slowed with a finger. The hum of the highway went on, oblivious. "Say something," I called, forcing a smile I did not feel. "What did you guys play?" The boy kept walking. His mouth opened a little, then closed, like he'd started to speak and forgotten how. His hands lifted an inch from his sides, then settled back. His gaze never left my face. There was no recognition in it. Not confusion, not fear, just intent. Every part of me rebelled. I took a half step back. The fire popped behind me, a small burst of sparks jumping up into the air. My eyes flicked to the familiar things in camp. Our tent, our cooler, the dent in the side of the lantern from that time I dropped it. All of it anchoring me to the idea that this was real life, not some story you tell in the dark. Behind the bathhouse, somewhere in that direction, a smaller, breathless voice shouted, "Mom." It was my son's voice. Not just the sound of it, but the way he bent my name. The exact panic note he hit when he'd been out of sight too long. An instant later, I heard the slap of sneakers on gravel from that direction and caught a glimpse of him sprinting around the corner of the cinderblock building, dirty, hair mussed, cheeks flushed. My heart did a sharp double beat. In front of me, the boy at the tree line had stopped at the invisible line where our sight began. He stood on the edge of the lantern's throw, light cutting across his chest, leaving his legs darker, his face in a strange, uneven shadow. His head tilted to one side, slowly, like a dog trying to puzzle out a sound. Behind me, the real weight of my son's body collided with my hip as he reached me, wrapping an arm around my waist, breathing hard. "I got lost," he panted. "I was with the kids, and then I followed the wrong bike, and then I couldn't find our tent, and—" I put a hand on his head, fingers tangling in his hair, every muscle in my body tight. "It's okay," I said automatically, eyes still on the figure by the trees. "You're okay. You're here." He turned, following my gaze. "Who's that?" he asked, voice small now. The not quite right boy mirrored the tilt of my son's head, as if he'd been taking cues from both of us the whole time. The space where his eyes should have caught the light stayed strangely flat. He took one slow step backward, foot finding the shadow beyond the gravel, then another, until his hoodie blended into the dark trunks behind him. For a second, his face seemed to hang there alone, pale and expressionless, like a cutout stuck to the black. Then that too slid away, swallowed by the tree line. The campground sounds rushed back in a wave. A truck door slammed. Someone laughed too loud at a joke. A child whined about bedtime. The highway hummed steadily. My son's breath tickled my side as it slowed. I realized my hand was shaking where it rested on his shoulder. We didn't stay up late after that. I killed the fire earlier than I'd planned, doused the coals until they hissed, and ushered him into the tent with some flimsy excuse about an early hike. He didn't argue the way he usually would. The woods beyond the safe circle had become a black wall with weight to it, and he kept glancing that way, as if expecting the other version of himself to step back out. Inside the tent, the artificial light from nearby RVs turned the fabric a dull orange. Shadows of people moving in their own little worlds drifted across it. The mix of smells, propane, smoke, hot dogs, damp earth, seeped through. The highway's murmur was louder here, closer to white noise. "Did you see him?" my son asked once we were zipped in. "The boy?" "Yeah," I said. "I saw someone. He had my shirt," he said. "Like mine, but wrinkled wrong." It was such a specific, strange observation that a shiver ran through me. "What happened when you left the kids?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He told me how he'd followed another child's bike toward the bathhouse, then turned around and realized he didn't recognize any of the tents nearby. How he'd tried calling for me once, but the sounds of the campground had swallowed his voice. How? For a minute he thought he saw me sitting by a fire that wasn't ours. And when he blinked, It was a stranger. Then I went around the building, he said, and I saw the trail sign. And then I knew where our row was. He curled closer in his bag. I don't like the trees, he added quietly. Me either, I said, and left it at that. We didn't hear anything else unusual that night. No whispering from the woods, no footsteps at the boundary of the light. Just normal campground life, ebbing and flowing until eventually even that dulled as people went to bed. My son fell asleep with his hand clenched in a fold of my sleeve. I woke up once, deep in the dark, with no idea what had pulled me out of sleep. For a moment, I thought I heard a child laughing outside. A short, clipped sound that could have been joy or could have been something trying it on for size. When I held my breath and really listened, there was only the highway and the faint rumble of an RV's heater kicking on. In the morning, light and noise made the night feel far away. Kids rode their bikes in fresh clothes. Parents poured coffee at picnic tables. Someone's dog barked at a squirrel. The woods looked like woods again, a solid green wall waiting for the day. Out of some stubborn impulse, I walked over to the spot where the other boy had stood. Gravel crunched under my shoes. The boundary between campground and forest felt arbitrary in daylight, a line we'd agreed on, not one the trees recognized. There were footprints, of course, dozens of small sneaker prints where kids had played the previous evening. Mine from when I'd taken the trashes out. Nothing that said, this is where the wrong boy was. I stood there until my son called me back to help pack. When I turned away, I had the distinct, irrational sense of being observed from just beyond where my eyes chose to focus. Not by an animal, not by another adult, by something waiting to see if I'd notice it trying on a new shape again. On the drive home, my son drew pictures in the condensation on the back window, trees, a tent, little stick figures. In one of them, there were two of him. When I asked about it, he shrugged. Just in case, he said, in case the other one's still there. We don't camp at big family campgrounds near trailheads as much anymore. When we do, I pay attention to the way the lights fall, to where the kids gather, to how many times I see my son in a glance without having to look twice. And when parents talk about how safe it feels to be surrounded by other people, I think about the line of black trees just beyond the last lantern and wonder how many things out there are watching and learning what familiar looks like. If this kind of story sends a chill down your spine, you're exactly the kind of person Haunted Fears is made for. Make sure you subscribe to Haunted Fears, turn on all notifications, and share this video with someone who still thinks every campground is safe. Because out here, sometimes the scariest thing is the face you recognize,